Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to venture into a world of shadowed laboratories, cryptic texts, and the quiet, obsessive pursuit of the impossible. We're going to talk about the Alchemists, but we're not going to just picture the cliché of the bearded old man in a Gothic tower trying to turn lead into gold. We're going to go much, much deeper than that, to uncover the remarkable story of human ingenuity, of grit, and of that incredible stubborn hope that the universe holds a secret just for us, if only we can learn its language. It's a story about the birth of chemistry, the preservation of ancient wisdom, and the very human dream of transcending our own limitations. As always, if you enjoy what I do here, a simple like, a subscribe, or a comment is always deeply appreciated, but only if you genuinely enjoy it. No pressure. I always love to see where everyone is listening from. It's a quiet comfort to know there's this little community, spread all across the globe, all settling in for the night together. So feel free to say hello and where you're from down below. Now though, it's time to let all of that go. Find that perfect spot. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There's nothing else you need to do right now, except listen. Chapter 1. Echoes of Alexandria, the ancient roots of the great work. To understand the medieval alchemist, hunched over his furnace in some damp European cellar, we can't start in the Middle Ages. We can't even start in Europe. We have to go back, way back, to a place where the sun was hotter, the river was the source of all life, and the world was already ancient. We have to go to Egypt, but not quite the Egypt of the pharaohs, of the great pyramids rising from the sand. We need to go to an Egypt that had been conquered, changed, and infused with a new, vibrant, and argumentative culture. We're going to Hellenistic Egypt, specifically to the city of Alexandria around the time of Christ and the centuries just after. Just try to picture it for a moment. Alexandria, a city founded by Alexander the Great, a jewel on the Mediterranean coast. It was the original melting pot, a place where Greek logic and philosophy collided head-on with thousands of years of Egyptian mysticism and practical craft. It was a city of scholars and sailors, of merchants and mystics. The air itself must have hummed with 1,000 different languages and 1,000,000 different ideas. In the grand markets you could smell spices from the east, hear the sharp logical debates of Greek philosophers in the colonnades, and in the temples, feel the ancient heavy silence of Egyptian gods who had been worshipped for millennia. And at the heart of it all was the great library of Alexandria, not just a collection of scrolls, but the intellectual engine of the entire known world. It was humanity's first great attempt to collect all knowledge, all stories, all theories, under one roof. It was an act of breathtaking ambition, and it was in this swirling cocktail of cultures, in this environment of intense intellectual curiosity, that the seed of alchemy was first planted. The Egyptians were master artisans. For thousands of years they had been working with metals. They knew how to mine, how to smelt, how to alloy. They could work gold with a skill that still astounds us today. They knew how to create brilliant pigments for their tomb paintings, how to mummify the dead with a complex cocktail of chemicals, how to brew beer and bake bread with repeatable, predictable processes. This was a deep, practical, hands-on knowledge of how to transform matter. But for the Egyptians, this was never just craft. It was always tied to the sacred. Their pigments weren't just colours, they were imbued with divine meaning. Their metals weren't just materials. Gold was the flesh of the gods, silver their bones. Every physical process had a spiritual echo, a divine counterpart. Into this world of sacred craft came the Greeks, with their insatiable hunger for understanding the why. They weren't content to just know that a process worked. They wanted to know the principles behind it. They brought with them the ideas of Aristotle and Plato, the idea that the entire physical world was composed of 4 basic elements, earth, water, air, and fire, and that these elements were not fixed, but could be transformed one into another by altering their fundamental qualities, hot, cold, wet, and dry. So you have this perfect fusion. On one hand, you have the Egyptian artisans in their workshops, their hands stained with chemicals, masters of physical transformation. On the other, you have Greek philosophers, with their abstract theories about the very nature of matter. Alchemy was born in the space between the workshop and the philosopher's study. It was the moment someone looked at a lump of lead in a crucible, and instead of just seeing a cheap heavy metal, thought, according to Aristotle's principles, this is just a combination of cold and dry. Gold is hot and wet. So what if I could just change its qualities? What if I could help this metal along on its journey to perfection? This wasn't just about getting rich. That idea came much, much later. In its purest, earliest form, this was a philosophical quest. The Greeks believed that all matter was striving for perfection. They saw the cosmos as a ladder, with inanimate rock at the very bottom, and the divine, the stars, the heavens at the very top, gold being incorruptible. It doesn't rust, it doesn't tarnish, was seen as the most perfect of metals. It was the final, glorious state that all other base metals were secretly trying to reach. The early alchemists, then, saw themselves not as a counterfeiter, but as a kind of midwife to nature. They weren't trying to trick the universe, they were trying to help it along, to speed up a natural process that might otherwise take thousands of years, and to do it right there in their own furnace, or as they called it, an athanor. This grand idea, this synthesis of Egyptian craft and Greek philosophy, needed a figurehead. It needed a patron saint, a legendary founder to give it legitimacy and mystery, and they found the perfect candidate in a figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus, which translates to Hermes the Thrice Great, wasn't a real person in the way you and I are. He was a magnificent piece of cultural and religious branding. The Greeks who came to Egypt noticed that the Egyptians worshipped a god called Thoth. Thoth was the god of writing, of wisdom, of magic, and the moon. He was the divine scribe, the keeper of secrets. The Greeks looked at this figure and said, he sounds a lot like our god Hermes. Hermes was the messenger god, the god of commerce, boundaries, and a bit of a trickster. He was the one who could travel between the world of the gods and the world of mortals. So in the grand Alexandrian tradition of mixing everything together, they syncretized the two. They blended Hermes and Thoth into one, creating Hermes Trismegistus. They imagined him as an ancient, wise king or priest who had lived thousands of years in the past and had received a divine revelation. He was said to have understood all the secrets of the cosmos, astrology, magic, and of course the great art of alchemy. He was credited with writing tens of thousands of books, a legendary library of cosmic secrets. Of course, these texts were not ancient Egyptian scripts. They were written much later, during this Hellenistic period, but they were attributed to this legendary figure to give them an aura of profound, unassailable authority. It's like releasing a new self-help book today and claiming it was written by King Solomon. It just gives it a certain weight. And among all these thousands of supposed books of Hermes Trismegistus, one text stood out, a piece of writing so short, so dense and so cryptic that it became the foundational document for all of Western alchemy for the next 2,000 years. It was called the Emerald Tablet. The legend of the tablet is as mysterious as its contents. Some stories said it was found by Alexander the Great in Hermes's tomb, others that it was discovered by Sarah, the wife of Abraham. The stories all agree on one thing: it wasn't written on flimsy papyrus, but was inscribed on a single massive slab of flawless, brilliant emerald. The very medium was part of the message. This was knowledge that was eternal, incorruptible, and precious beyond measure. The text of the Emerald Tablet itself is incredibly short. You could write it on a postcard, and if you read it without context, it sounds like a series of strange, poetic riddles. It doesn't give you any recipes. It doesn't say take 2 parts lead, add 1 part sulfur, heat to 500 degrees. It's nothing like that. It's a philosophical poem, a coded map of the universe. It begins with the famous line, "That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to perform the miracles of the one thing. As above, so below." This one phrase is the heart of the alchemical worldview. It's a statement of cosmic sympathy, of a universe that is holographic, where the smallest part reflects the whole. The alchemist believed that the human body, the microcosm, was a reflection of the solar system, the macrocosm. The 7 known metals of the time, gold, silver, iron, copper, mercury, lead, tin, were believed to correspond to the 7 known celestial bodies: the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter. So, when an alchemist was working with lead in his laboratory, he wasn't just manipulating a dull metal. In his mind, he was working with the cosmic principle of Saturn, the principle of old age, of slowness, of death and decay, and when he sought to turn it into gold, he wasn't just trying to make a pretty yellow metal, he was attempting to imbue that lead with the principle of the sun, with vitality, with perfection, with incorruptible life. The work in the laboratory, the below, was a mirror of a great spiritual and celestial drama playing out above. The transformation of the metal was inseparable from the transformation of the alchemist's own soul. They believed you couldn't perfect the metal without first perfecting yourself. The great work, as they called it, was as much an internal spiritual journey as it was an external chemical one. The rest of the tablet is just as mysterious. It speaks of the one thing, the prima materia, or first matter, from which all things in the universe are made. It talks of separating the subtle from the gross, of the power of the sun and moon, of a force whose strength is entire if it is converted into earth. It's not a user manual, it's a meditation. It's designed to be contemplated, to be puzzled over for a lifetime. It hints at a great secret but never reveals it outright. It was the perfect foundational text because it was endlessly interpretable. Every alchemist could read it and find their own meaning, their own path forward. It was a divine riddle, and they would spend the rest of their lives and the lives of their students for centuries to come trying to solve it. For several centuries, this hermetic tradition, this proto-alchemy, bubbled away in the philosophical and spiritual stew of the late Roman Empire. It mingled with Gnosticism, a mystical form of early Christianity that believed the material world was a prison created by a lesser god, and that salvation could be found through secret knowledge, or gnosis. This resonated perfectly with the alchemists, who also sought a secret knowledge to redeem and perfect base matter. But then, the world changed. The Roman Empire began to crumble. The great library of Alexandria, which had already suffered from fires and neglect, faded into memory. The intellectual energy of the Mediterranean world began to dim. Europe was entering the period we call the Dark Ages, and it seemed for a time that this strange, beautiful and complex art of alchemy, along with so much other classical learning, might simply vanish, a whisper lost in the wind. But knowledge, as we said, is a stubborn thing. It doesn't like to die, it just travels. It seeks out new homes, new minds to nurture it. And as the lights went out in Europe, a brilliant new civilization was rising to the east, the world of Islam. While Europe was struggling with fragmentation and decline, the Islamic world was entering its golden age. From Spain to India, a new empire, united by faith and a thirst for knowledge, was building magnificent cities, great universities, and libraries that dwarfed anything Europe had seen since Alexandria. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus became the new centers of learning for the entire world. The early Islamic caliphs, the rulers of this vast empire, had an obsession. They were obsessed with knowledge. They saw no conflict between their faith and the study of the natural world. Rather, they saw it as a way of understanding and appreciating God's creation. They sent agents across the known world to gather texts from Greece, from Persia, from India. They launched a massive translation movement, centered in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, a legendary library and academy. They translated Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, all the great minds of the classical world from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. And among the texts that they found, that they rescued from the dustbin of history, were the works of the Alexandrian alchemists. They discovered the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the cryptic wisdom of the Emerald Tablet, and the technical recipes of figures like Zosimos of Panopolis, one of a handful of early alchemical writers whose names we still know. But the Arabic-speaking scholars weren't just passive translators. They didn't just preserve this knowledge, they transformed it. They took the mystical, philosophical, and often chaotic ideas of the Alexandrians and began to apply a new level of rigor, of systemization, and of practical experimentation. They were the ones who truly began to turn alchemy from a spiritual art form into something that starts to look, to our modern eyes, a little bit like science. And one name stands above all others in this pivotal chapter of our story, Jabir ibn Hayyan. In the West, he was later known by the Latinized name Geber, and for centuries he was regarded by European alchemists as the undisputed master of the art. Jabir lived in the 8th century, likely in Kufa, a city in modern-day Iraq. He was a polymath, a man of staggering intellect, who wrote on everything from medicine and astronomy to philosophy and grammar. but his great passion was alchemy, or as it was called in Arabic, alchemia, which is of course where we get our word. The sheer volume of writing attributed to Jabir is immense, hundreds if not thousands of treatises. It's so vast that modern scholars are pretty sure it wasn't all written by one man, but was likely the product of a whole school of anonymous alchemists who wrote under his prestigious name. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is the coherent system and the revolutionary approach contained within the Jabirian corpus. Jabir took the four elements of the Greeks' earth, air, fire, water, and their four qualities, hot, cold, wet, dry, and built upon them. He proposed that metals were not formed directly from these elements, but from two intermediate principles, sulfur and mercury. Now, it's crucial to understand, when Jabir talked about sulfur and mercury, he wasn't necessarily talking about the common yellow rock and the silvery liquid metal we know today. He was talking about philosophical sulfur and philosophical mercury. Sulfur was the principle of combustibility, of fire, of masculinity. It was what made things burn and what gave metals their soul. Mercury was the principle of fusibility, of liquidity, of the metallic sheen, of femininity. It was what gave metals their body. According to this theory, every metal was composed of a different combination of this sulfur and this mercury. A perfect, pure balance of the two resulted in gold. A slight imbalance, a contamination with some earthy impurity, resulted in silver. If the sulfur was impure and the mercury was unstable, you got a base metal like lead. You can see how powerful this theory was. It gave the alchemist a clear conceptual framework for transmutation. The goal was no longer some vague, mystical process of perfecting matter. The goal was now specific, to purify the sulfur and mercury within a base metal, and to rebalance them into the perfect proportion that would create gold. It was a theory that practically begged to be tested in the laboratory. And the laboratory was where Jabir's work truly shone. The writings attributed to him are filled with detailed, practical instructions for building chemical apparatus and performing experiments. He gives clear descriptions of processes that would become the absolute bedrock of chemistry for the next 1,000 years. Distillation, for example, the process of heating a liquid to create a vapor and then cooling the vapor to collect the condensed liquid. The Jabirian texts describe the construction of the alembic, the classic pot-bellied still with its long swan-like neck, which would become the iconic symbol of the alchemist's lab. Through distillation they could separate liquids, purify water, and most importantly, create powerful acids for the first time in history. Using a process called dry distillation on minerals like vitriol and saltpeter, they were able to isolate substances like sulfuric acid and nitric acid. This was a monumental leap forward. For the first time, humanity had solvents that could dissolve substances that were previously thought to be indestructible, including, with a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acid called aqua regia or royal water, even gold itself. Imagine the sense of power to hold in a glass vial a liquid that could make the most perfect, incorruptible metal on earth simply vanish. It must have felt like wielding a piece of divine power. The Jabirian corpus is also obsessed with a concept that we might recognize today, quantification. Jabir believed that everything in the universe was based on a system of balance and proportion. He developed a bizarre and fantastically complex numerological system where he assigned numerical values to the Arabic letters of a substance's name, and through a series of arcane calculations, tried to determine the balance of its inner nature. It was a dead end, of course, a kind of mystical mathematics. But what's important is the impulse behind it, the desire to move beyond vague qualities and to understand the world in terms of precise numerical relationships. It was a first, tentative step on the very long road towards the periodic table. Life in Jabir's workshop must have been a world of sensory impressions, the constant gentle bubbling of the alembics, heated by sand baths or dung heaps to maintain a slow, steady temperature for weeks on end, the sharp, acrid smell of vinegar, the choking fumes of burning sulfur, the mesmerizing sight of liquids dripping slowly from the beak of the still, each drop a tiny victory, a concentration of some hidden essence. There would have been mortars and pestles for grinding minerals into fine powders, crucibles for heating metals to glowing incandescence in the furnace, and dozens of carefully labeled glass and ceramic jars holding the mysterious substances they had created or collected. And perhaps most importantly, There would have been the meticulous taking of notes. Jabir and his school stressed the importance of documentation, of writing everything down. Their goal was to create repeatable experiments. While the language was still shrouded in allegory and code words, they called substances the green lion or the wolf's blood to protect their secrets. The underlying principle was there. Knowledge had to be earned through patient, disciplined, hands-on work. You couldn't just think your way to the philosopher's stone. You had to get your hands dirty. The work of Jabir and his school laid the theoretical and practical foundation. The next great figure in this story, who lived about a century later, would take that foundation and build upon it, pushing alchemy even further down the path of practical medicine and empirical observation. His name was Abu Bakr al-Razi. Known in the West as Rhazes, al-Razi was one of the giants of the Islamic Golden Age. He was a physician first and foremost, a brilliant diagnostician who ran a major hospital in Baghdad. He was a champion of clinical observation and rational thought, famously being the first to differentiate between smallpox and measles. He was a humanist, known for treating the poor for free and for his belief that even his enemies should be treated with kindness. But he was also a dedicated alchemist, and he brought the same clear-eyed empirical mindset from his medical practice into his laboratory. If Jabir was the great theorist, al-Razi was the great classifier. He looked at the chaotic world of alchemical substances and sought to bring order to it. In his book, Sarir al-Asrar, or The Secret of Secrets, he provides one of the first systematic classifications of chemical substances. He dismisses all the numerology and opaque symbolism of Jabir. He's not interested in the hidden meanings of names. He wants to know what things are and what they do. He divides all the substances used in alchemy into clear categories. First, he lists the spirits, volatile substances like mercury, sulfur, and arsenic sulfide. Then, the bodies, which are the 7 metals. Then he creates a category for stones, like pyrites and glass. He lists different forms of vitriol, different kinds of salts, different kinds of borax. He's creating a taxonomy of the chemical world. Even more revolutionary is his detailed listing of laboratory equipment. He describes beakers, flasks, phials, crucibles, hearths, and stills with the practical eye of an expert craftsman. He explains what each tool is for and how to use it properly. Reading al-Razi, you get the sense of a man who spent countless hours in his lab, a man who knew his equipment intimately, who understood through long experience which type of clay made the best crucible for high temperatures, which kind of glass was least likely to crack when heated. His work represents a crucial shift in attitude. While he still believed in the possibility of transmutation and the existence of the elixir, the substance that could perfect metals, and also in a medicinal form, perfect the human body and grant long life, his primary focus was on the practical operations. He was a master chemist. His books are filled with recipes for creating chemical compounds, for purifying substances, for performing complex distillations. He was less concerned with the as above, so below, and more concerned with the what happens if I mix this with that. With al-Razi, the mystical dream of Alexandria is now firmly grounded in the tangible reality of the Baghdad laboratory. The quest for the philosopher's stone had created, as a kind of magnificent side effect, a deep and practical knowledge of chemical substances and processes. The Islamic alchemists had invented new apparatus, discovered new and powerful chemicals, and most importantly, they had established a tradition of rigorous hands-on experimentation. They had taken the seed that was planted in Hellenistic Egypt, nurtured it, cultivated it, and allowed it to grow into a strong and sturdy plant. They had created a vast body of literature, a treasure trove of both practical recipes and profound, if esoteric, theory, and now that knowledge was ready to travel again. Starting around the 11th and 12th centuries, a new cultural exchange began. Christian scholars from Europe, particularly from Spain, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian cultures had coexisted for centuries, in a state of relative peace known as the convivencia, started to become aware of the vast intellectual riches stored in Arabic libraries. A new translation movement began, this time from Arabic into Latin, the scholarly language of medieval Europe. Adventurous scholars like Robert of Chester travelled to Spain specifically to seek out these texts. In 1144, he completed the first Latin translation of an Arabic book on alchemy, and in the preface to his translation, He writes with a palpable sense of excitement, introducing this new exotic science of alchemy to the Latin-speaking world, and so the journey was complete. The whispers of Hermes, born in the melting pot of Alexandria, amplified and systematized in the great cities of the Islamic Golden Age, finally arrived in the chilly monasteries and burgeoning universities of medieval Europe. But it did not arrive as a clear, straightforward science. It arrived shrouded in mystery, bearing the authority of ancient sages and legendary masters like Geber and Rhazes. It came with the tantalizing promise of impossible things, of turning lead into gold, of creating an elixir that could cure all diseases and grant eternal youth. It came as a secret, a powerful and perhaps dangerous form of knowledge. The European mind that received this knowledge was very different from the one that had created it. It was a world steeped in a different faith, grappling with different philosophical questions. And as this new old science of alchemy began to take root in this new soil, it would once again begin to transform, to mutate into something new and strange. It would become the grand and often desperate obsession of the medieval world, the story of which we will begin to explore next time. For now, just rest with that image, the image of knowledge as a traveller, a message in a bottle passed from one civilization to another across a vast ocean of time, from the sun-drenched workshops of Alexandria to the meticulous laboratories of Baghdad, and finally to the doorstep of a Europe that was just beginning to awaken from a long slumber. A secret whispered from Hermes to Jabir, to the unknown monk who would first open a Latin translation and feel his world expand with a new and thrilling possibility. The great work had a long way to go, but its foundations were now firmly in place, built by some of the most brilliant and curious minds the world had ever known. Chapter 2. The Magnum Opus. In pursuit of the philosopher's stones. And so, the great work. 2 words that sound so simple, so manageable. It sounds like a grand project, certainly, but a project nonetheless, like building a cathedral or writing a particularly long book. But for the alchemist, standing at the threshold of his laboratory, those 2 words held the weight of the entire cosmos. It wasn't a project, it was the project, the only one that truly mattered. The magnum opus was the alchemist's Everest, his holy grail, his lifetime appointment with a notoriously stubborn furnace, and a set of instructions written in riddles. It was a combination of a divine recipe, a grueling spiritual marathon, and a philosophical home chemistry kit for which the most crucial components were maddeningly vague. Imagine for a moment, you decide to bake the most complicated cake in the world, but the recipe doesn't list ingredients like flour or sugar. Instead it says, first take the green dragon which devours the sun. The instructions don't say preheat the oven to 350 degrees. They say, subject the serpent to the gentle fire of the philosophers until it weeps tears of the moon. And the final step isn't frost and serve, but witness the birth of the Red King, united with his White Queen in a bed of glass. This was the reality of the alchemist. They were attempting to follow a divine cookbook, where every single ingredient was a metaphor, and every instruction was a philosophical koan. The goal of this epic undertaking was the creation of a substance of legend, the philosopher's stone, a name that conjures images of shimmering crystals and magical powers, and in a way that's not far off. The stone was believed to be a dense, heavy powder, sometimes described as red like a ruby, other times as yellow like saffron, sometimes even as a translucent, waxy material. Its powers were twofold, each addressing a fundamental human anxiety, poverty, and death. First, it was the ultimate transmuting agent. A tiny pinch of this reddish powder, the legends claimed, when wrapped in wax and thrown into a crucible of molten lead or mercury, could instantly transform the entire mass into pure, perfect gold. This process was known as chrysopoeia, and while it's easy for us to dismiss this as simple greed, for the alchemist, it was deeply philosophical. Gold wasn't just valuable, it was perfect. It didn't rust, it didn't tarnish, it was incorruptible. In their eyes, other metals like lead were simply sick or immature gold. Transmutation wasn't about creating something from nothing. It was about healing the metal, about helping it achieve its final, most perfect state of being. It was a metallic redemption story, but its second power was even more profound. If you took the stone and dissolved it in a special solvent, usually purified wine or spirits, it would create the elixir of life. This was the ultimate medicine, the universal panacea. A single dose could supposedly cure any disease, from the common cold to the plague. Taken regularly, it could reverse the aging process, restore youthful vigor, and grant a lifespan that stretched not for decades, but for centuries, even millennia. It was the ultimate wellness trend, promising a cellular-level glow-up that would last quite literally forever. Forget your morning vitamins. The alchemist was seeking a sip of eternity. So, how did one even begin such a world-altering task? You couldn't just pop down to the local market for philosopher's stone ingredients. The very first step, and arguably the most difficult, was to obtain the starting material. This was the prima materia, the first matter. And if you ask what the prima materia was, well, congratulations, you've just asked the single most debated question in the entire history of alchemy. The texts were deliberately, infuriatingly obscure on this point. They called it by 1,000 names: the virgin's milk, the serpent, the chaos, the green lion, the dew of heaven. Some alchemists believed it was a common, everyday substance, something overlooked and despised by the ignorant. They would say, it is thrown in the street, trampled underfoot by all, yet it is the most precious thing in the world. This led some to experiment with things like manure, urine, dirt, and even human blood. You can imagine the smells emanating from those particular workshops. Others believed it was a specific mineral, like antimony or cinnabar. A few, more esoterically minded, believed the prima materia wasn't a physical substance at all, but a spiritual essence that had to be captured from the air or from starlight. Whatever it was, this first matter was seen as the raw, undifferentiated stuff of creation. It was the potential for everything, but the reality of nothing. It was pure chaos in physical form, and the entire great work, the Magnum Opus, was the long, arduous process of taking this chaotic, unformed stuff and guiding it, step by step, through a process of death, purification and resurrection, until it achieved its final, perfect form as the stone. It was less like chemistry and more like raising a divine child, a very, very difficult child who had to be dissolved, burned, and put back together again before it would behave. The work was typically divided into 4 major stages, sometimes 3, distinguished by the color of the material in the alchemist's flask or retort. These weren't just chemical markers, they were signposts on a profound spiritual journey. The alchemist believed that as the matter in the flask was perfected, so too was his own soul. The laboratory was a mirror. The great work was an inside job. The first stage, the one that broke the spirit of many an aspiring philosopher, was the nigredo, the blackening. The name itself tells you almost everything you need to know. This was the stage of putrefaction, of dissolution, of death. The alchemist would take his chosen prima materia, seal it in a vessel called the hermetic egg, a round-bottomed flask with a long neck, sealed by melting the glass shut, and place it in a special furnace called an athanor, which was designed to maintain a slow, steady heat for weeks or even months on end. The goal here was to kill the substance, to break it down into its most basic components. The alchemist would watch as the material in the flask slowly decomposed, bubbling and turning into a dark, foul-smelling, homogeneous sludge. This was the blackness, the nigredo. It was often compared to the rotting of a corpse in a tomb. The text would say, unless the grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it produces much fruit. The alchemist had to become a philosophical mortician, overseeing the decay of his material. The smells would have been memorable. This process often involved sulfur and mercury, the alchemical king and queen, and the stench of heating sulfur compounds is something you don't easily forget. It's the smell of primordial chaos, of volcanic vents, of a world being unmade. This was a process that required the patience of a saint and the olfactory tolerance of a medieval sanitation worker. For months, the only visible result of this tireless work was a flask full of black goo. Many gave up here, convinced they had failed, that they'd simply created a very expensive and very smelly mess. But for the true adept, the nigredo was a crucial and profound spiritual experience. The blackness in the flask was a mirror for the blackness in their own soul. This was the dark night of the soul, the confrontation with one's own mortality, ego, and inner demons. To succeed, the alchemist had to let his own pride and arrogance dissolve along with the matter in his retort. He had to face his own internal chaos, The symbolic animal for this stage was the raven or the crow, a creature of darkness and death. The ruling planet was Saturn, the grim, restrictive father figure of the cosmos. The associated metal was lead, the heaviest, dullest, and most dead of all metals. It was a state of absolute despair, the lowest point from which the entire work had to be built back up. You had to go to rock bottom, chemically and spiritually, before you could begin the ascent. If the alchemist could endure the long months of the Negredo, maintaining the fire, his faith, and his lunch, he would eventually be rewarded with a sign, a subtle shift. As the process continued, tiny star-like sparkles might appear on the surface of the black sludge. This was called the fish's eyes. And then, slowly, miraculously, the blackness would begin to recede. The dark, putrefied mass would begin to clarify, to separate. A new color would emerge. This was the beginning of the second stage, the albedo, the whitening. After the long, dark winter of Negredo, albedo was the spring. It was a stage of washing and purification. The black matter, which represented the dead body, was now subjected to a series of distillations. The alchemist would carefully heat the flask, causing the volatile spirit of the substance to rise as a vapor, collect in the cool neck of the flask, and then rain back down upon the dark body at the bottom. This was described as a kind of internal baptism. The spirit was washing the body, cleansing it of all its blackness and impurity. Over and over this process would be repeated. It was a slow, meticulous act of cleansing. Imagine trying to wash a black shirt until it becomes pure white, simply by letting steam condense and drip on it for a few months. The patience required is almost unimaginable to our modern minds, which tend to get antsy if a web page takes more than 3 seconds to load. Eventually, the constant washing would work its magic. The entire contents of the flask would transform into a brilliant, shining white powder or salt. This was a moment of immense joy and relief for the alchemist. He had navigated the darkness and emerged into the light. The matter in the flask had been resurrected, reborn in a state of purity and innocence. This white substance was sometimes called the white eagle, or the blessed stone, and it was considered a major milestone. Some believed that this substance itself was a lesser philosopher's stone, capable of transmuting base metals into pure silver. Spiritually, the albedo represented enlightenment, the purification of the soul. Having faced the darkness of the Negredo, the alchemist's spirit was now washed clean, innocent and receptive, like a newborn. The symbolic animal was the white swan, or the dove, creatures of purity and grace. The celestial body was the moon, with its cool, silvery, reflective light. The albedo was the dawn after the longest night, a promise that the great work was not only possible, but well and truly underway. The soul of the alchemist and the matter in his flask were now pure, but they were not yet perfect. They had been cleansed, but they lacked power. They were the White Queen, awaiting the arrival of her king. From the pristine white of albedo, the journey continued. The next stage is a curious one, known as citrinitas, the yellowing. It's curious because in later alchemical texts, from the 15th century onwards, this stage is often omitted, with the process moving directly from the white of albedo to the red of the final stage. It's like a deleted scene from the cosmic movie of creation. But for many earlier alchemists, it was an essential step. After achieving the perfect whiteness, the alchemist would begin to increase the heat of his furnace. The gentle, steady fire that produced the albedo was now intensified. This was a delicate operation. Too much heat too quickly, and the entire work could be ruined, the vessel cracking, or the delicate white substance burning back to blackness. This would be the alchemical equivalent of a game over screen, forcing the poor philosopher to start the whole multi-month process all over again. You can almost feel the tension in the laboratory. The alchemist hunched over his furnace, carefully feeding it fuel, watching the sealed flask with an anxiety we might reserve for disarming a bomb. Under this intensifying fire, the white matter would slowly, beautifully begin to transmute once more. It would take on a pale, citrus yellow hue, which would then deepen into a rich golden yellow. This was the citrinitas. It was seen as the true dawn, the rising of the sun after the pale lunar light of the albedo. The matter was no longer just pure, it was beginning to be infused with energy, with the solar principle of light and power. The spiritual allegory here is one of maturation. If Negredo was death, and albedo was rebirth, Citrinitas was the process of growing up. The innocent newborn soul of the albedo was now developing its wisdom and strength. It was the dawning of true philosophical understanding. The alchemist was no longer just pure of heart. He was now gaining the divine intellect, the gnosis that would allow him to complete the work. The symbolic animal often associated with this stage was the eagle, soaring towards the sun, representing the soul ascending to greater heights of consciousness. It's the moment the White Queen, pure and receptive, begins to see the golden light of her approaching king. The work was tantalizingly close to completion. The promise of gold was now visually present in the flask. But this wasn't the final gold. This was just the color of the sunrise, not the full fiery power of the midday sun. That was reserved for the final climactic act. And so we arrive at the grand finale, the culmination of all the sweat, fumes, and sleepless nights, the final stage of the Magnum Opus, the rubedo, the reddening. This was the stage that separated the masters from the mere students. It required the fiercest fire, the greatest skill, and the strongest nerve. Having brought the matter to the golden yellow of Citrinitas, the alchemist would now push his furnace to its absolute limit. The fire was raised to its highest possible temperature, a heat so intense it would make the sealed glass vessel glow with a life of its own. Inside this miniature man-made hell, the final miraculous transformation took place. The yellow powder would begin to shift in color, moving through orange, and then finally settling into a deep, vibrant ruby red. Some texts describe it as being the color of poppy flowers, or of fresh blood. This was it. This was the philosopher's stone. The process was often described in dramatic, mythological terms. This was the chemical wedding, the sacred marriage of the Red King, the solar fiery principle, and the White Queen, the lunar watery principle. Inside the flask, all opposites were finally reconciled. Sun and moon, fire and water, spirit and body, fixed and volatile. They were all fused into a single, perfect, incorruptible unity. The alchemist had taken the chaotic, unformed prima materia and guided it through death, nigrido, purification, albedo, and maturation, citrinitas, to its final glorious apotheosis. The symbolism of the rubedo is rich and powerful. The primary symbol is the phoenix, the mythical bird that burns itself to death on a pyre and is then reborn from its own ashes, more beautiful than before. This perfectly captured the essence of the great work, creation through destruction. Another potent symbol was the pelican, which in medieval legend was believed to pierce its own breast to feed its starving young with its blood. This represented the idea of sacrifice and resurrection, the stone giving its own life-giving essence to heal the sick metals or the ailing human body. Spiritually, the rubedo was the attainment of the ultimate goal. It was enlightenment, union with the divine, the realization of one's own inner divinity. The alchemist, having perfected the matter in the flask, had also perfected himself. He had united the warring opposites within his own soul and achieved a state of wholeness and integration. He was no longer just a man, he was an adept, a master, a co-creator with God, capable of wielding the fundamental forces of nature. After weeks or months at this intense heat, the furnace would finally be allowed to cool, and then the most nerve-wracking moment of all, breaking the seal of the hermetic egg. After perhaps a year or more of continuous work, the alchemist would finally hold in his hands the fruit of his labor, a small quantity of a heavy reddish powder, a substance that looked unassuming perhaps, but was believed to hold the key to limitless wealth, eternal life, and spiritual transcendence. The Magnum Opus was complete. Of course, this four-stage journey is a neat, tidy summary. The reality for the alchemist was anything but. Their laboratories were filled not just with strange bubbling liquids, but with the ghosts of countless failures. A cracked retort at the final stage could mean a year of work lost in a puff of smoke. A miscalculation in the heat of the furnace could ruin the entire batch, and the texts themselves were a constant source of frustration. They were designed to be obscure, to protect the sacred art from the unworthy. What one text called the Green Lion, another would call our Mercury, and a third would refer to as the philosophical vitriol. Were they all talking about the same thing? Or were these three different ingredients? It was like trying to solve a puzzle where every piece was labelled with a different riddle, and the instruction manual was a poem about a dragon. This led to the creation of some of the most beautiful and bizarre documents of the medieval and Renaissance periods. Since plain language was forbidden, alchemists communicated through symbols and allegories. They created an entire symbolic ecosystem to describe chemical processes. For instance, you might see a drawing of a green lion ferociously devouring the sun. To the uninitiated, it's a strange mythological image. To an alchemist, it was a chemical recipe. The green lion was often a term for a powerful acid, like sulfuric acid, and the sun was the symbol for gold, so the image simply depicted the process of dissolving gold in acid. A picture of a king being drowned in a river could represent a metal being dissolved in a solvent. A wolf devouring a king, and then being thrown into a fire to burn away, leaving the king purified, was a real metallurgical process for purifying gold, using antimony sulfide, the wolf. They created a whole menagerie of symbolic beasts. The Ouroboros, the snake or dragon eating its own tail, was a perfect symbol for the cyclical nature of the work, of distillation and condensation, of the idea that the end is in the beginning. The double-headed eagle, or the two-headed dragon, represented the dual nature of substances like mercury, which was seen as both a physical metal and a spiritual essence. The red king and the white queen, often depicted naked and embracing, were the personifications of the solar, sulfur, and lunar mercury principles, whose union was necessary for creation. And then there were the diagrams, astoundingly complex and intricate drawings that were less like chemical flowcharts and more like maps of a mystical dreamscape. The famous Ripley Scrowl, a series of long illustrated manuscripts from the 15th century, shows the entire alchemical process in a series of cryptic allegorical scenes featuring birds, beasts, suns, moons, and hermaphroditic Adam and Eves. There was also the Mutus Liber, the silent book, published in the 17th century, which contained no words at all, only a series of 15 intricate plates that supposedly revealed the entire secret of the Philosopher's Stone to those who were clever enough to decipher the visual narrative. These images weren't just decorative, they were highly condensed packages of information. They contained astronomical timings, telling the alchemist when to perform certain operations based on the positions of the planets. They showed the type of equipment to be used, the colors that should be observed, and the philosophical mindset that should be adopted. For the alchemist, learning to read these diagrams was as important as learning to manage his furnace. It was a language of pure symbol, a way of communicating the incommunicable. The secrecy had several motives. Part of it was practical. In a world with no patent laws, an alchemist who believed he was on the verge of a great discovery was not about to publish his methods in plain language for any rival to steal. This was high-stakes research and development, and industrial espionage was a real concern. There was also the very real fear of the church. An art that claimed to perfect nature and grant immortality could easily be branded as heretical. Claiming you could create a substance that perfected God's creation was a bold move, and it was safer to couch such claims in the language of prayer and philosophical allegory. But the deepest reason for the secrecy was philosophical. The alchemists genuinely believed that the secret of the stone was the most powerful knowledge a human being could possess. In the wrong hands, it could cause untold chaos. A greedy king with the ability to create infinite gold could destabilize the world's economies and fund endless wars. An evil man with the elixir of life could live forever to perpetrate his wickedness. Therefore, the knowledge had to be protected. The cryptic language of the texts acted as a filter. They believed that only a person who was patient, wise, and pure of heart would be able to persevere through the frustrating allegories and decipher their true meaning. The unworthy, the greedy, and the impatient would simply give up in frustration. The texts themselves were a test, and the first piece of equipment an alchemist had to perfect was his own character. So we are left with this incredible image of the solitary philosopher poring over these strange and beautiful texts under the flickering light of a candle. He is surrounded by the tools of his trade, the bulbous glass retorts, the sand baths for gentle heating, the tall distillation columns, and at the centre of it all, the ever-hungry Athanor, the furnace that had to be kept alive like a sacred flame, sometimes for years on end. He is a strange hybrid figure, part mystic, part scientist, part artist, part madman. He is engaged in a quest so audacious it borders on the absurd, a quest to compress the entire cosmic process of creation into a single glass flask. He is driven by a dream of perfection, the perfection of metal, the perfection of the body, and ultimately, the perfection of the soul. The Magnum Opus was a beautiful, holistic vision of the universe, where the mineral, human, and celestial realms were all interconnected, all reflections of one another. To purify a metal was to purify oneself. To understand the stars was to understand the chemistry in the flask. It was a worldview of profound unity, a stark contrast to our own highly compartmentalized, specialized world. Whether anyone ever truly succeeded is a matter of legend and faith. The history of alchemy is filled with tales of mysterious adepts who appeared out of nowhere, performed a public transmutation for a disbelieving prince or goldsmith, and then vanished as mysteriously as they came. Men like the enigmatic Fulcanelli in the 20th century, or the legendary Count of Saint Germain in the 18th, who seemed to never age and possessed limitless wealth. Are these tales true, or are they just the hopeful projections of an art that was always just one step away from its ultimate goal? Perhaps in the end, it doesn't matter. The true gold of alchemy wasn't necessarily the substance produced in the crucible. It was the process itself, the relentless pursuit of knowledge, the deep introspection, the development of virtues like patience and perseverance. The alchemists in their smoky, cluttered workshops were laying the groundwork for modern chemistry. They were pioneers in distillation, metallurgy, and the study of acids and bases. They were meticulously observing, experimenting, and recording, even if their theoretical framework was, to our eyes, a fantasy. The Magnum Opus was a grand, beautiful failure in one sense, but a profound success in another. It failed to produce an elixir of immortality, but it gave birth to a new way of questioning the world. The philosopher's stone remains a legend, a dream of ultimate power and perfection, but the quest to create it, the great work, was very real. It was a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, our unquenchable curiosity, and our eternal, hopeful belief that somewhere, hidden within the chaotic dross of the ordinary world, lies a spark of perfection, just waiting for a patient hand to coax it into a brilliant, redeeming fire. And for the alchemist, hunched over his glowing furnace, listening to the gentle bubbling in his sealed flask, that hope was enough to keep the flame alive through the longest and darkest of nights. Chapter 3. The Secret Workshop. Athanors, Alembics, and Arsenic. That hopeful flame, that brilliant redeeming fire, was not just a metaphor, it was a real, physical thing. It was the heart of a hidden world, a secret space tucked away from the prying eyes of the uninitiated. For all the grand philosophy, for all the celestial aspirations, the great work was, at its core, a profoundly hands-on endeavor. It was a craft, a messy, smelly, and often dangerous business conducted in a place that was part laboratory, part sanctuary, and part disaster waiting to happen. So, let's dim the lights a little further now, and step quietly through a door that was almost always locked. Let's push aside the heavy curtain and breathe in the unique atmosphere of the alchemist's workshop. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, but the smell. It's a complex and layered aroma that tells a story all its own. There's the foundational scent of a coal or charcoal fire, a dry, dusty heat that's been burning for, well, possibly for months. Layered on top of that is the sharp, metallic tang of minerals, the acrid bite of sulfur, like a devil's own hard-boiled egg. There's the faintest, sweetest, almost cloying scent of distilled herbs or flowers, a ghost of some failed experiment or a minor tincture. And underneath it all, there's the pervasive, earthy smell of the building itself, damp stone, old wood, dust, and maybe, just maybe, the faint whiff of something that has gone terribly wrong. It's the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and hair, a scent that marks you as someone who meddles with the very building blocks of the world. And where are we? Well, we're almost certainly not in a storefront on the main square. Secrecy was paramount. The alchemist was a figure of immense suspicion. To the church, his work could look suspiciously like magic, an attempt to usurp God's creative power. To the local lord, he might be a counterfeiter, trying to devalue the currency by whipping up a batch of gold. And to his neighbours, he was simply the strange fellow in the house at the end of the lane, the one from which odd-coloured smoke sometimes billowed at 3 a.m. Paranoia was a professional necessity. So the workshop, the laboratorium, was hidden. It might be in a stone-lined cellar, where the earth itself could muffle the sound of a sudden, unplanned explosion, and the darkness was a constant, reliable companion. Or it could be in a dusty attic, a garret tucked up under the eaves, where the fumes could be vented through a loose tile in the roof, mistaken for simple chimney smoke. Sometimes a wealthy patron might provide a dedicated outbuilding, a small stone tower on the edge of an estate, affording both privacy and a degree of plausible deniability, should the local magistrate come asking questions. Whatever the location, the space itself was one of organized chaos. Forget the pristine, white-tiled laboratories of modern science. The alchemist's workshop was a creature of soot and shadow. The walls would be stained, marked with the ghosts of vaporous experiments, a spectrum of colours from angry red to sulphurous yellow. Shelves would sag under the weight of earthenware pots, glass vials, and mysterious leather-bound pouches. The floor, whether stone flag or rough-hewn plank, would be gritty with spilled powders, charcoal dust, and the residue of countless operations. It was a space that felt lived in, not just worked in. It was a testament to obsession. And at the very centre of this cluttered cosmos, glowing with a patient inner light, was the furnace. This wasn't just an oven, this was the Athanor. The name itself is mysterious, likely derived from the Arabic al-Tannour, but for the alchemists it was so much more. It was the philosophical oven, the womb in which matter would be gestated and reborn. It was the heart of the workshop, and its pulse was a steady, unyielding heat. Building an Athana was a work of art in itself. It was the alchemists' first great test of patience and skill. They were typically brick or stone structures, often layered with clay and plaster for insulation. The goal was not raging, uncontrollable heat, but a gentle, constant and precisely controlled warmth, the kind of warmth a hen gives her egg. In fact, the alchemical vessel sealed within the Athana was often called the philosophical egg, and the furnace was its nest. The entire great work was an act of artificial incubation, and the Athana was the mother. It was a demanding parent. It required constant feeding. An alchemist would spend a small fortune on fuel. Charcoal was best for its even, smokeless heat, but wood or coal would do in a pinch. The fire couldn't just be lit in the morning and banked at night. For certain crucial stages of the work, which could last for weeks or even months, the heat had to remain absolutely constant. This meant a life lived by the furnace's rhythm. The alchemist would sleep near it, on a simple cot, waking every few hours to check the temperature and add more fuel. He would learn its language, the soft sigh of the bellows, the gentle crackle of the coals, the specific colour of the glow that meant the heat was perfect. It was an intimate, exhausting relationship. The designs were ingenious, born from centuries of trial and error. There might be multiple chambers, a lower one for the fire itself, and an upper one, a sort of slow cooker, where the vessel sat in a sand bath, or a bed of warm ash to distribute the heat evenly. There were vents and flues to be adjusted, tiny little shifts that could make the difference between success and a cracked flask. To the modern eye, it's a simple brick oven, but to the alchemist, its every proportion, its every curve, was imbued with cosmological significance. It was a microcosm of the universe, and the fire within it was the creative spirit of God, harnessed in miniature. Forget your smart thermostat that you can control from your phone. This was a relationship built on instinct, soot, and a profound lack of sleep. Now, sitting within that warm embrace of the Athanor is the glassware, and if the furnace was the sturdy, reliable heart of the operation, the glassware was its delicate, beautiful soul. We think of medieval technology as clunky, all wood and iron, but alchemical glassware was different. It was elegant, ethereal, and surprisingly sophisticated. The glassblowers of Venice, or the forest glass artisans of Germany, were masters of their craft, and the alchemists were their most demanding customers. They didn't just ask for bottles, they had a whole menagerie of specialized vessels, each with a specific purpose and a wonderfully evocative name. The most fundamental was the alembic. Picture a gourd-shaped flask with a long, swan-like neck that droops downwards. You would heat a substance in the bulbous base, the cucurbit. The vapours would rise, collect in the domed cap, the head or capital, and then as they cooled condense and trickle down the long spout into a receiving flask. This was the workhorse of distillation, the process of separating the volatile, the spirit from the fixed, the body. It was a way of purifying, of extracting the essence of a thing. An alchemist would spend countless hours watching this slow, patient process, drop by drop, as a cloudy, muddy liquid was transformed into a crystal-clear distillate. It was a miracle in miniature. Then you had the retort. This looks a bit like an alembic that's been tipped on its side, a simple sphere with a long tapering neck bent at an angle. It was used for distillation and digestion, for processes that required heating a substance for a long time without its essence escaping. Its simple closed design made it perfect for observing transformations, for watching colours shift and change through the glass as the subtle fire of the ethanol did its work. And some of the glassware was just wonderfully strange. There was the pelican, or the circulatory vessel. This was a single piece of glass, a flask with two curved arms that rose from its sides and bent back down to re-enter the main body. When you heated it, the vapours would rise up the arms, condense and flow back into the liquid below. It was a self-contained system, a closed loop designed for endless circulation. The idea was to force a substance to constantly reabsorb its own spirit, to marry its volatile and fixed parts over and over again until they achieved a new, perfected union. It was a physical manifestation of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, a symbol of eternity and cyclical perfection. It's a beautiful, hypnotic thing to imagine, this constant silent reflux, a substance endlessly baptizing itself in its own essence. These glass vessels were not mass-produced. Each one was hand-blown, a unique creation. They were precious and terrifyingly fragile. A moment's inattention, a sudden surge in the furnace's heat, a hidden flaw in the glass, and a vessel that had been patiently cooking for months could crack with a sickening pop. And that wouldn't just mean the loss of the experiment. It could mean a spray of boiling, corrosive acid, or the release of a cloud of toxic vapor. Every alchemist had scars from such accidents. It was the price of doing business. They learned to handle their glassware with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic. Each piece was washed carefully, stored meticulously, and treated with a respect born of both its cost and its potential for catastrophic failure. Imagine trying to conduct a complex chemical reaction in hand-blown glass that might have the structural integrity of a Christmas ornament, and you get a sense of the daily, nerve-wracking tension in the workshop. So we have the furnace and the glassware, but what were they putting inside these beautiful, fragile vessels? What were the raw materials of the great work? The answer is, well, everything. Alchemists were the original experimental hoarders. They would collect minerals from mines, plants from the forest, strange salts from dried-up riverbeds, and less savoury substances from the animal kingdom. But at the heart of their theory were three core principles: the tria prima, mercury, sulfur, and salt. Now, when an alchemist spoke of mercury, he didn't necessarily mean the silvery liquid metal we know as quicksilver, although he certainly used a lot of that. To him, mercury was a principle. It was the principle of fusibility, of volatility, of the spirit. It was the metallic, watery essence in all things. It was the passive, feminine aspect of matter. Quicksilver was simply its most perfect physical expression, a metal that was also a liquid, a substance that seemed to defy the normal rules of the world. It was a trickster, beautiful and deadly. Alchemists were fascinated by its ability to dissolve other metals, to form amalgams, and they spent countless hours trying to fix it, to solidify its fleeting nature into something permanent and noble. Then there was sulfur. Again, this wasn't just the yellow brimstone rock. It was the principle of fire, of combustion, of the active masculine soul. It was the oily, inflammable quality that existed in all things. It was what allowed a substance to burn, to change, to act upon the world. The alchemist saw the universe as a marriage between the fiery, active spirit of sulfur and the watery, passive spirit of mercury. Every substance in the world contained these two principles in a different ratio. A base metal like lead had too much watery, impure mercury, and not enough fiery, pure sulfur. Gold, on the other hand, had them in perfect, harmonious balance. The great work, in one sense, was a cosmic marriage counseling session, an attempt to purify the base metals mercury and sulfur, and then recombine them in the correct golden proportion. And the third principle, added later by Paracelsus, was salt. Salt was the principle of fixity, of the body, of manifestation. If mercury was the spirit, and sulfur was the soul, salt was the physical vessel that held them together. It was what gave a thing its solid, tangible form. It was the unburnable ash left behind after a fire, the indestructible matrix of a substance. With these three principles, the alchemists had a framework to understand the entire material world. Everything, a rock, a plant, a person, was a unique combination of mercury, sulfur, and salt. To change something, you simply had to alter the ratio. It's an incredibly elegant and poetic way of looking at the world, even if it has little to do with the modern periodic table. But the alchemists didn't just work with principles. They got their hands dirty with the real thing. Their shelves were lined with jars of powders and liquids with names that sound like a wizard's shopping list. There was vitriol, the corrosive sulfuric acid they learned to distill, which they called the green lion for its power to devour metals. There was aqua fortis, strong water, or nitric acid, and aqua regia, royal water, a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids, so named because it was the one substance that could dissolve the king of metals, gold itself. And then there were the poisons. The alchemist worked with substances that would give any modern safety inspector a heart attack. Arsenic, for instance, a brittle greyish element. When heated, it doesn't melt, it sublimates, turning directly into a gas with a distinct garlic-like odour. Its compounds, particularly the white arsenic trioxide, were a common ingredient in alchemical recipes. They were used in processes to whiten copper, hoping to create a kind of silver. Of course, arsenic is also a potent cumulative poison. The alchemist, breathing in its fumes day after day, working with the white powder that could so easily be mistaken for flour or salt, was slowly incrementally poisoning himself. The tremors, the stomach pains, the slow decline, many likely attributed it to spiritual trials or the influence of malevolent planets, rather than the contents of the jar on the second shelf. Another favourite was antimony, a substance that, when purified, forms beautiful crystalline structures, a silvery star-like pattern called the regulus of antimony, or the philosophical star. This visual clue was irresistible. It looked like a sign from the cosmos, a key to the inner nature of metals. They used it to purify gold, creating a substance they called the grey wolf because of how it devoured base metals, leaving only the gold behind. But antimony, like arsenic, is profoundly toxic. Its fumes could cause lung disease, and handling it was a constant risk. They were flirting with death on a daily basis, all in the pursuit of a symbol, a hint that they were on the right path. And let's not forget the mercury itself, the pure liquid metal quicksilver. Its fumes are a powerful neurotoxin. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from the felt-making industry, where mercury was used to treat the fur, and the workers inevitably suffered from severe neurological damage. The alchemist, who spent his days gently heating mercury in his flasks, breathing in the invisible, odourless vapour, was running the exact same risk. The irritability, the depression, the trembling hands, these were the occupational hazards of the great work. They were dancing on a razor's edge, surrounded by substances that were both keys to transformation and instruments of their own slow demise. Safety precautions were, let's say, more of a personal philosophy than a set of regulations. There were no fume hoods, no safety goggles, no gloves. The primary safety measure was to hold your breath and hope for the best, perhaps murmuring a prayer as you uncorked a particularly pungent vial. This constant, intimate relationship with danger shaped the alchemist's worldview. It fostered a deep respect for the materials. They weren't just inert chemicals, they were powerful, temperamental beings with their own personalities. Mercury was a trickster, antimony a ravenous wolf, arsenic a pale ghost. To work with them was to enter into a negotiation, a battle of wills. Sometimes you won, and a substance would yield a beautiful new colour or form, and sometimes you lost. Losing could be spectacular. The risk of explosion was constant. A flask sealed too tightly, a sudden spike in heat, an unforeseen reaction between two volatile ingredients, and the entire experiment could end in a deafening bang and a shower of razor-sharp glass. An alchemist might spend weeks carefully preparing a substance, only to have it detonate, destroying his precious glassware, covering his workshop in a toxic, stinking mess, and possibly taking off a few of his fingers in the process. We have records of alchemists being killed when their laboratories exploded, taking half the house with them. It's the ultimate DIY project gone wrong. Each time an alchemist sealed a flask and placed it in the athanor, he was in essence building a small, unpredictable bomb, and then sitting next to it for a month. It required a unique brand of courage, or perhaps just a profound level of obsessive focus that crowded out any sense of self-preservation. And even if things didn't explode, the air itself was a constant enemy. The fumes were a witch's brew of toxins, sulfur dioxide from burning brimstone, which would catch in the throat and sting the eyes, the aforementioned mercury and arsenic vapours, the choking clouds from bubbling acids. The workshop would have been a place of constant, low-level chemical assault. We can imagine our alchemist, his eyes watering, a cloth held over his nose and mouth, squinting through the haze to read the subtle colour change in his flask. It's a miracle any of them lived to old age. The pursuit of immortality was, ironically, a very effective way to shorten one's life. So how did they navigate this minefield of explosive, poisonous materials? How did they know what to do? They had no chemistry textbooks, no standardized procedures, no YouTube tutorials. What they had were manuscripts, beautiful, cryptic, and often deliberately misleading manuscripts. The knowledge of alchemy was passed down in secret, through hand-copied texts that were treasured possessions. A single book could represent a lifetime of savings. These weren't straightforward instruction manuals. To protect their secrets from the unworthy and the merely curious, alchemists wrote in a coded, allegorical language. They wrote in riddles and metaphors, veiling their chemical processes in the language of mythology and mysticism. You wouldn't find a recipe that said, "Gently heat iron sulfide with salt and dissolve the result in water." Instead, you might read something like, "Take the grey wolf, the son of Saturn, and feed him to the red king, then wed the king to the white queen, and dissolve their union in the bath of Neptune." It was up to the reader, the adept, to decipher the code. The grey wolf might be antimony. The red king could be gold, or a symbol for sulfur. The white queen might be mercury, or purified silver. The bath of Neptune is probably just water. Probably. Each term could have multiple meanings, and authors would often use the same term to mean different things in different places, just to keep things interesting. It was less like reading a scientific paper, and more like interpreting a surrealist poem. Next time you complain that a recipe from the internet has a vague instruction like "bake until golden brown," spare a thought for the poor alchemist trying to figure out what "wash the black crow 3 times in the eagle's tears until it becomes the white dove" actually means he's supposed to do with a lump of lead ore. And accompanying these cryptic texts were the images. Alchemical illustrations are some of the most bizarre and fascinating works of art from the period. They are a fever dream of symbols. You'll see green lions devouring the sun, kings and queens dissolving in baths, 2-headed hermaphrodites wielding a compass and a square, winged serpents and dragons fighting in a flask. These weren't just decorations, they were flowcharts. Each element in the drawing represented a substance, a process, or a philosophical concept. One of the most famous examples is the Ripley Scrowl, a set of magnificent illustrated scrolls from the 15th century. It's a long, winding allegorical poem that supposedly contains the secret to the Philosopher's Stone, depicted through a series of vivid, surreal images. You see a man standing on a dragon, holding a philosophical egg. You see birdmen and toad-like creatures. It's a visual feast, but as a practical guide it leaves something to be desired. It was believed that only a true adept, someone who was spiritually prepared, could understand the true meaning of the images. They were a test. If you couldn't understand the allegory, you weren't worthy of the knowledge. It was the ultimate security system, one that relied on the intellectual and spiritual purity of the user. This meant that the alchemist's primary tool, even more important than his furnace or his flasks, was his mind. His work was not just a physical craft, it was an act of interpretation, a deep intellectual puzzle. He would spend hours, days, poring over a single sentence, comparing different manuscripts, trying to cross-reference the symbols. He'd meditate on an image, hoping for a flash of insight, a moment of divine inspiration that would unlock its meaning. And of course there was no guarantee that the manuscript he was studying was even correct. Many were deliberate fakes written by charlatans to sell to gullible patrons. Others were honest attempts that were simply wrong, the product of a failed experiment written down with wishful thinking. And even the correct texts were subject to the errors that creep in through hand copying. A tired scribe could easily miscopy a symbol or a word, changing dove to crow, and sending some poor alchemist down a completely fruitless and possibly explosive path for years. There was no peer review, There was no way to verify your sources. You had to rely on intuition, faith, and an enormous amount of trial and error, mostly error. This leads us to the rhythm of the work itself. The daily life in the workshop was one of immense, almost inhuman patience. The great work was not a quick process. It was divided into stages, often associated with colours. The first stage was the nigredo, the blackening. This was a process of putrefaction, of breaking down the initial materials into a uniform black sludge, the prima materia. This could take 40 days or more of gentle, continuous heating in the athanor. The alchemist would watch his sealed flask, waiting for that moment when everything within it turned a deep, uniform black. This was a sign of death, the death of the old, corrupt forms, and it was the first great success. Then came the albedo, the whitening. After the blackness, as the heat was carefully increased, a white, shining substance was supposed to appear, like a frost or a dew condensing on the glass. This was the resurrection, the creation of the white stone, which was said to have the power to transmute base metals into silver. This stage was even longer and more delicate. Following the white came the citrinitas, the yellowing, a transitional stage often compared to the dawn, before the final glorious sunrise. And finally, if the alchemist was skilled and lucky, and perhaps divinely favoured, he would achieve the rubido, the reddening. The matter in the flask would transform into a deep ruby-red powder, the philosopher's stone, the Red King, the ultimate goal of the entire art. This final stage represented perfection, the union of spirit and matter, the creation of a substance that could not only turn lead into gold, but also cure all diseases and grant long life. Each of these stages could take months. The entire process from start to finish could take a year or more, a full year of tending the fire, of watching, of waiting, of praying that the flask doesn't crack, that the colours appear in the right order, that the cryptic instructions in your 200-year-old manuscript were interpreted correctly. It was an act of supreme devotion. The alchemist lived in a different kind of time, a slow, cyclical time dictated by the patient transformations in his flasks. The seasons would change outside his grimy window, but his focus remained fixed on the microcosm he was nurturing in the heart of his furnace. Imagine the quiet intensity of that space. The only sounds are the soft hiss and crackle of the fire, the gentle bubbling of liquid in a sealed pelican, the scratch of a quill pen as the alchemist makes a note in his journal, sketching a strange new crystal formation he's observed. The air is warm and thick with the smells of his art. His world has shrunk to this one room, to this one great experiment. It's a life of profound isolation, but also of profound purpose. He is not just mixing chemicals, he is midwifing the birth of a new perfected world in a glass egg. He is a collaborator with God, finishing the work of creation. The secret workshop, then, was so much more than a place of work. It was a private universe. It was a stage where the great cosmic drama of death and rebirth was enacted on a miniature scale. Every piece of equipment, from the humble brick furnace to the elegant glass retort, was a sacred object. Every substance, from the dull grey lead to the glistening quicksilver, was a living entity with a story to tell. And the alchemist himself was the high priest of this strange, smoky religion. A patient, obsessive, and endlessly hopeful soul, seeking not just to change metal, but to transform himself, to find the gold that was hidden not just in the earth, but within his own spirit. And as he sat there in the quiet glow of the athanor, listening to the soft pulse of his experiment, he was perhaps as close to perfection as he would ever get. The work itself, the patient and loving act of creation in the face of constant failure and danger, was its own reward, a quiet fire burning brightly against the long, uncertain night. Chapter 4. Beyond Gold. Iatrochemistry, Distillations, and Proto-Science. That quiet fire burning against the long night was indeed its own reward. The patient, almost devotional act of watching and waiting, of nurturing a reaction in the belly of a glass flask, was a meditation. But while our alchemist sought the perfection of his own soul, the fire in his athanor was doing something far more tangible. It was, quite without intending to, forging the very tools of the modern world. The great work was a spiritual quest, absolutely, but it was also, in a way, the most productive and consequential series of failures in human history. Because for every alchemist who dreamed of a spiritual ascent, there was a physical reality. A room, smelling faintly of sulphur and damp stone, shelves cluttered with oddly shaped glass vessels, each with a name that sounded like a mythical creature: the retort, the alembic, the pelican. There were mortars and pestles, crucibles stained with the ghosts of 1,000 experiments, and handwritten notes in a script so full of symbols and codes it looked less like a lab journal and more like an attempt to write a letter to an angel. They were chasing a dream, but they were doing it with their hands. They were mystics who by necessity had to become master craftsmen, glassblowers, metallurgists, and obsessive note-takers. And this is where the story pivots. This is where the quest for the Philosopher's Stone, that single miraculous substance, splinters into 1,000 different practical discoveries. The alchemists, in their relentless pursuit of a magical key to unlock the universe, accidentally began to catalogue the locks. They didn't find the one great secret, but they found countless smaller ones along the way. They were, in essence, the world's first true experimental chemists, even if they would have been horrified by the title. They were trying to perform magic, but in order to do so, they had to obey the very real, very unmagical laws of physics and chemistry. And through that obedience, through trial and error, so much error, they began to map out the territory that we now call science. Think of their laboratory not as a wizard's tower, but as the original startup garage. It was a place of radical, often dangerous innovation. Their funding was precarious, their goals were wildly ambitious, and their safety protocols were, shall we say, aspirational. The idea of a peer-reviewed journal was several centuries, and a few unfortunate explosions away. Knowledge was guarded, written in code, passed from master to apprentice. And yet, within these secretive little workshops, the foundations of our chemical world were being laid, one bubbling concoction at a time. Let's start with one of the most fundamental shifts. For centuries, humanity had known of only a few weak acids. There was vinegar, acetic acid, which could dissolve some things, and the gentle acids from fruits. They were useful, but they were the chemical equivalent of a butter knife. The alchemists, in their quest to break down and purify matter, needed something stronger. They needed a chemical sledgehammer, and they found it by torturing minerals. They would take a common mineral, a greenish crystalline substance called vitriol, what we would call iron or copper sulfate, and they would heat it. They would roast it mercilessly in a furnace, and as they did, a thick, oily, incredibly corrosive vapor would rise. They learned to capture this vapor and condense it into a liquid. The result was a substance they called oil of vitriol. We call it sulfuric acid. It's hard to overstate what a monumental discovery this was. This wasn't just a new substance, it was a new category of power. This oil of vitriol could do things that seemed utterly miraculous. It could dissolve metals that had been considered permanent and incorruptible. It reacted violently with water, generating incredible heat. It would turn sugar into a black column of carbon, as if by dark magic. To the alchemist, this was a revelation. It was a tool of immense potency, a key that could unlock the hidden nature of substances. They had found a universal solvent, or something very close to it. Suddenly, they could break down ores, separate mixtures, and purify metals in ways that had been impossible before. They were like chefs who had just been handed a blowtorch. But they didn't stop there. Their curiosity, their relentless tinkering, pushed them further. They took their new oil of vitriol and mixed it with another common substance, saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, the main ingredient in gunpowder. They heated this mixture, and once again, a powerful vapor arose. When condensed, it formed a pale yellow liquid they called aqua fortis, which means strong water. This was nitric acid, and aqua fortis was even more aggressive in some ways. It could dissolve silver with an angry fizz, releasing a foul reddish-brown gas. But here was the truly fascinating part. It couldn't touch gold. You could drop a gold coin into a vial of the most potent aqua fortis, and it would sit there gleaming and utterly indifferent, as if mocking the acid's fury. For the alchemist, this was a profound clue. Gold's resistance to this powerful new solvent was further proof of its perfection, its incorruptibility, but it was also a practical tool. Now, for the first time, they had a surefire way to test for gold. If you had a piece of metal that you thought was gold, you could drop it in aqua fortis. If it dissolved, it wasn't pure. It was a perfect, definitive test, and it revolutionized assaying and metallurgy. It was the bane of every con artist trying to pass off a gilded piece of lead as the real thing. But of course, the alchemical mind couldn't leave it at that. If there was a substance that could dissolve silver but not gold, their logic demanded that there must be something that could dissolve gold. They were obsessed. They tried everything, and eventually, some brilliant unknown alchemist had the idea of mixing the two most powerful substances they had ever created. They took their aquafortis, the nitric acid, and mixed it with another acid derived from common salt, what we call hydrochloric acid. The result of this mixture was a fuming, terrifyingly corrosive liquid that they named aqua regia, the royal water, because this, finally, was the liquid that could do the impossible. It could dissolve the king of metals. It could make solid, perfect, incorruptible gold vanish into a clear solution. Imagine the awe. Imagine seeing a solid piece of the most precious substance on earth slowly dematerialize in a flask. To them, this was not just a chemical reaction. It was a philosophical and mystical event of the highest order. They had found a way to unmake gold, to revert it to its primordial liquid state, and if they could unmake it, they reasoned, surely they could remake it, but better. This was, they believed, a giant leap towards the philosopher's stone. For us, looking back, it's the invention of a fundamental tool of modern chemistry, one still used today to refine precious metals. Their magical quest had once again stumbled into the territory of industrial science, all because they wanted to see what would happen if they boiled a rock. While the discovery of these powerful acids was a story of aggressive, violent transformation of dissolving and destroying, another, gentler art was being perfected in the alchemist's lab. It was the art of distillation. If you see a picture of an alchemist's workshop, you will always see the strange swan-necked glass vessel known as the alembic. This single piece of equipment represents perhaps their most significant contribution to our daily lives. The theory behind distillation was deeply spiritual. Alchemists believed that every substance in the world, a plant, a mineral, a metal, was composed of two parts, a gross physical body and a subtle invisible spirit, or quintessence. The body was temporary and corruptible. The spirit was the pure, eternal essence of the thing. Their goal was to find a way to separate this spirit from its crude physical container, and distillation, they believed, was the way. It was a process that mirrored the ascent of the soul. You would take a substance, say a collection of herbs or a cask of wine, and place it in the heated base of the alembic. As the gentle heat was applied, the most volatile part of the substance, its spirit, would rise as vapor, leaving the heavier earthly parts behind. This vapor would travel up into the cool, curved cap of the alembic, where it would condense back into a liquid, like dew forming on a leaf. This purified liquid would then trickle down a long spout and be collected, drop by precious drop in a receiving flask. Drip, 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 the slow rhythmic pulse of the laboratory. It was a beautiful theory, and when they applied it to wine, the results were astonishing. They weren't trying to invent liquor. They were trying to capture the spirit of wine, its very soul. They gently heated the wine, watching the vapors rise and condense. The liquid that dripped out of the alembic was clear, potent, and most strangely of all, it would burn. You could set a spoonful of it alight, and it would dance with a cool blue flame. They had created something entirely new, a liquid that was like water but held the fire of the sun. They called it aqua vitae, the water of life. We know it as alcohol, the distilled spirit that forms the basis of brandy, whiskey, gin and vodka. They believed this aqua vitae was a miracle substance because it was the purified spirit of the grape. They thought it held incredible medicinal properties. It was a preservative, a disinfectant, a powerful solvent, and of course a potent medicine that could bring warmth to the body and cheer to the soul. An ailing patient might be given a small dose to restore their vitality. And for the first time, physicians had a powerful medium in which to dissolve herbs and create tinctures, concentrating their medicinal properties in a way they never could with water or wine alone. The next time you see a row of spirits in a bar, remember that each bottle is a direct descendant of a mystical experiment. The alchemist, seeking the elixir of life, accidentally created the nightlife of the future. The same process was applied to everything. They distilled rose petals to create fragrant rose water and potent rose oil, launching the perfume industry. They distilled herbs to create essential oils for medicine and aromatherapy. They were breaking down the world into its most fundamental scents and flavors, capturing the ghost of a flower in a bottle. Each drop that fell from the alembic was a tiny victory, a confirmation of their worldview, and another small practical step towards a more refined and aromatic world. But the alchemist's influence wasn't confined to the vials on his own shelves. His work bled out into the wider world, often through the artist's studio. In an era before standardized, pre-packaged art supplies, painters had to be part-time chemists. And where did they turn for the most vibrant, permanent pigments? To the alchemists, who were masters of manipulating minerals and metals. The brilliant, fiery red that illuminates so many medieval manuscripts, that was vermilion, a pigment created by the careful heating of mercury and sulfur. It was a dangerous, tricky process, a miniature great work in itself, transforming two substances into a third, completely different one. The alchemist who perfected this wasn't just making a chemical, he was making beauty possible. The purest, most opaque white was lead white, made by exposing lead plates to the fumes of vinegar. This process created a pigment of unmatched brilliance, but it was also, of course, incredibly toxic. The artists who used it, grinding it with oil, were slowly poisoning themselves in the service of their art. The vivid greens were often verdigris, a pigment made by the corrosion of copper, another alchemical staple. The alchemists were the material scientists of their day. They didn't just invent new colors, they improved the very stuff of creation. They learned how to make better, clearer glass, which was essential for their own experiments. A flaw in a flask could cause it to shatter under heat, ruining a month's work and possibly blinding the experimenter. Their demand for higher quality glassware spurred on the glass-making industry, leading to the legendary workshops of Venice. Better glass meant better lenses, which meant better telescopes and microscopes down the line. The quest to see the soul of a metal ultimately helped us see the craters on the moon and the bacteria in a drop of water. They were masters of metallurgy, not just in their attempts to make gold, but in creating practical alloys. Their understanding of how to mix metals, how to purify them with acids, how to test their quality, was invaluable to coin makers, armorers, and bell founders. The knowledge that dripped out of the alchemist's lab was a secret ingredient, enriching the entire ecosystem of craftsmanship around it. They may have been secretive, but their discoveries had a way of getting out, transforming the color, clarity, and strength of the world around them. And this brings us to perhaps the most radical and controversial application of alchemical thought. It was a revolution that sought to transform not lead, but the human body itself. This was the birth of what would be called itrochemistry, or chemical medicine, and its champion was one of the most brilliant, arrogant, and disruptive figures of the Renaissance, a Swiss physician and alchemist who called himself Paracelsus. To understand how revolutionary Paracelsus was, you have to understand the medicine he was fighting against. For over 1,000 years, European medicine had been completely dominated by the theories of the ancient Greek physician Galen. Galen medicine was based on the idea of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four fluids in perfect balance. Sickness was simply a matter of having too much or too little of one humour. If you had a fever, you had too much blood, so the treatment was bloodletting. If you were melancholic, you had too much black bile. The cures were all about rebalancing the system, purging, sweating, bleeding, and gentle herbal remedies to coax the humours back into alignment. It was a holistic philosophical system, and it had been the unquestioned medical orthodoxy for centuries. Then came Paracelsus. He was a wanderer, a firebrand, a man who learned not just from university books but from miners, barbers, and village healers. He looked at the medical establishment of his day and saw nothing but stagnant dogma. In one of his most famous acts, he publicly burned the works of Galen and Avicenna, the pillars of traditional medicine, declaring that his own shoelaces knew more than they did. He was, to put it in modern terms, a disruptor who had zero chill. His central idea was a direct application of alchemy to the human body. He declared that the body was not a sack of humours, it was a chemical system, a microcosm that mirrored the great chemical system of the universe, the macrocosm. Therefore, disease was not a simple imbalance. It was a specific, localized problem, often caused by an external agent, a poison that had invaded a particular organ. A problem in the liver wasn't a problem of the whole system's humours. It was a chemical problem in the liver, and if the disease was chemical in nature, the cure must also be chemical. This was the great leap. Paracelsus rejected the gentle herbal remedies of the past. He argued that to fight a strong poison from outside, you needed a strong medicine from inside. And where did you find the strongest medicines? Not in the garden, but in the earth, in the toxic, powerful minerals and metals of the alchemist's lab. He advocated for using tinctures of antimony, arsenic, mercury, and lead as medicines. To the traditional doctors, this was sheer insanity. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. They accused him of being a poisoner, a murderer, and to be fair, in the wrong hands, his remedies were absolutely deadly. But Paracelsus had a crucial insight, an idea that is now the absolute foundation of all modern pharmacology and toxicology. He famously wrote, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. The dose makes the poison." Think about that for a moment. This was a complete paradigm shift. A substance wasn't inherently good or bad. It was all a matter of quantity. Water can kill you if you drink too much. But a tiny, carefully measured dose of a metallic poison, he argued, could be a powerful medicine. It was the principle of like fights like. A poison from the earth could be used to fight a poison in the body. He developed a mercury-based treatment for syphilis that, while horrifically toxic, was actually effective and remained the standard of care for centuries. He created laudanum, an opium tincture, which was one of the most effective painkillers available until the modern era. He was essentially arguing that the alchemist's work of purification should be applied to medicine. You don't just give a patient a whole plant. You must, through alchemical processes like distillation, extract its quintessence, its active chemical principle. You don't just avoid minerals, you learn to purify them and administer them in precise, controlled doses. Paracelsus was, in many ways, a deeply mystical figure. He wrote about the three prime principles: salt, representing the body, sulfur, representing the soul, and mercury, representing the spirit, and believed they were the building blocks of all matter, including the human body. He believed in astrology and the spiritual forces of nature, and yet through this mystical framework, he bulldozed a path for a new kind of medicine, a medicine based not on balancing abstract humours, but on targeted chemical intervention. He and his followers, the Alchemists, were the pioneers of pharmacology. They were the first to systematically investigate the chemical properties of drugs and their effects on the body. They created new chemical compounds and tested them as remedies. They were often wrong, and their treatments could be brutal and dangerous. But they had grasped a fundamental truth, that life is, at its core, a chemical process, and that was a truth that would change medicine and the world forever. So we see the alchemist in a new light. He is no longer just the frustrated gold maker, surrounded by the smoke and failures of his singular obsession. He is an accidental revolutionary. In his search for the universal solvent, he gives us the powerful acids that will fuel the Industrial Revolution. In his search for the water of life, he gives us distilled spirits, perfumes, and the science of chemical extraction. In his search for perfect pigments, he becomes a master of material science, giving new colours to the artist and better tools to the craftsman. And in his application of these principles to the human body, he shatters 1,000 years of medical tradition and lays the groundwork for modern pharmacology. The great work, the transmutation of lead into gold, was never achieved. The philosopher's stone was never found. The elixir of life remains a dream. By these metrics, the entire endeavour of alchemy was a spectacular failure. But it was a failure that gave us chemistry, chemical engineering, and modern medicine. It was a magical art that, through its obsessive hands-on methodology, became the unlikely mother of empirical science. The alchemist sits in his lab late at night, the fire in the athanor casting a soft, warm glow. He is not watching lead turn to gold. He is watching wine slowly, patiently, give up its spirit, drop by drop, into a clean glass flask. The air is thick with the scent of herbs and the faint, acrid tang of mineral experiments. He is tired, the work is slow, and his patrons are demanding. But he is not just making a potent drink or a new medicine. He is practicing a new way of seeing the world, a way that involves not just accepting ancient texts, but testing, measuring, and observing, a way that trusts the evidence of one's own hands and eyes. In that quiet, rhythmic dripping, You can hear the faint, steady heartbeat of a new world being born, a world not of magic, but of matter, a world that the alchemist, in his wildest, most gold-fevered dreams, could never have imagined. And yet it was a world that he, more than anyone, helped to build. The work was its own reward, yes, but its true rewards would only become clear to the generations that followed, who would take his secret art and, step by painstaking step, turn it into our science. And now, perhaps, as the gentle heat of that furnace continues its slow work, you can let your own mind drift, separating the spirit from the body and easing into the quiet of the night. Chapter 5. Patrons, Frauds and Princes, the high stakes of transmutation. And as that gentle heat continues its slow work, let's just pause for a moment on that furnace, that aludel, that athonor, the quiet heart of the whole operation. It's a hungry thing. It demands charcoal and glass and strange minerals from faraway lands. It demands crucibles that won't crack under pressure and rare salts scraped from desert floors. It demands time. And in the medieval and Renaissance world, all of those things demanded one thing above all else: money. A great deal of money. The pursuit of the philosopher's stone was not a weekend hobby for the curious man of modest means. It was, in modern terms, a startup with astronomical burn rates, and it needed an angel investor, or, more accurately, it needed a patron, a very rich, very powerful, and, ideally, a very, very patient patron. This is where the quiet, smoke-filled world of the alchemist's laboratory collides with the loud, gilded world of the royal court. It's a fascinating and often treacherous intersection. On one side you have the alchemist, a figure of immense and secret knowledge, promising to unlock the very secrets of God and nature. On the other, you have a prince, a duke, a king, or even a pope, a person with near absolute power over the physical world, but who is still frustratingly bound by its limitations. Their treasuries could run dry after a costly war, their bodies could fail them with age and sickness, and their power was always threatened by rivals. So the alchemist comes to the prince, not with cap in hand, but with a whispered promise. It was the ultimate elevator pitch. "Your Grace," he might say, "your vaults are filled with lead and iron. Your enemies have gold, but the universe, in its wisdom, has made these metals siblings, not strangers. They are all born from the same seed of prima materia. They are merely in different states of maturity. I, and I alone, possess the secret art to hasten that process, to perfect that which is imperfect. Grant me a laboratory, a stipend, and your protection, and I will not just fill your coffers, I will make your wealth as boundless as the rivers, as endless as the sands of the sea." And the prince, looking at the bills for his last military campaign, or perhaps feeling a new ache in his joints, would listen, because as much as he was a man of power, he was also a man of his time, a time when the line between science, magic, and religion was a blurry, smoky haze. He believed in transubstantiation at the altar, the miracle of bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Christ. Why then was it so impossible to believe in the transmutation of lead into gold? It was a difference of degree, perhaps, but not of kind. It felt plausible, and the potential return on investment was, to put it mildly, infinite. So he would take the gamble. He would become the patron. This relationship was a strange and delicate dance. The alchemist was given a laboratory, sometimes a whole wing of a castle. He was given assistants, rare materials, and a salary that would make a court physician blush. In return, he was expected to produce. And herein lies the pressure. It wasn't like funding an artist, where you get a nice painting at the end regardless. The alchemist's work was binary. It was a pass or a fail. There was no partial credit for almost making gold. You either did it, or you didn't. Imagine the scene. The alchemist has been working for months, maybe years. The patron, who has been funneling a fortune into this smoky enterprise, decides it's time for a progress report. He descends into the laboratory, his silk robes brushing against dusty floors, the smell of sulphur and vinegar catching in his throat. He sees the bewildering array of glass, the cryptic charts on the wall, the ever-burning furnace, and he asks the simple, terrifying question, "Well, have you done it yet?" For the genuine adept, this was a moment of supreme anxiety. The great work was a spiritual journey as much as a chemical one. It couldn't be rushed. It required patience, purification of the soul, and the precise alignment of celestial bodies. "Your Majesty," he might plead, "the work is progressing. Saturn is not in the correct house. We must first achieve the negredo, the blackening, before we can hope for the albedo, the whitening." To a prince who just wanted a way to pay his mercenaries, this sounded a lot like an excuse. His patience, unlike his alchemists hoped for gold, was a finite resource. And this immense pressure, this desperate need to show results to a powerful and increasingly skeptical benefactor, created the perfect environment for the shadow of the true alchemist to flourish. The charlatan, the fraud. If the true alchemist was a philosopher and a mystic, the fraudulent alchemist, or the puffer as they were sometimes called, was a stage magician and a confidence man. They understood chemistry, yes, but their true mastery was in the art of human psychology. They understood greed. They knew that a man who desperately wants to believe something is the easiest man in the world to fool. So while the true adept was reading Paracelsus and meditating on the nature of Mercury, the puffer was perfecting his sleight of hand. He developed an arsenal of ingenious tricks, designed to create the illusion of transmutation, to produce that little fleck of gold at the crucial moment and keep the patron's money flowing. One of the most common tricks was the hollow stirring rod. The charlatan would arrive at court and put on a great show of his piety and secret knowledge. He would allow the prince's own men to provide the crucible, the lead, the charcoal. He would insist on transparency. "You see, your grace, I hide nothing." Then, at the critical moment, he would take his own special stirring rod, perhaps made of iron, and begin to stir the molten lead. The rod would have been hollowed out and filled with gold dust, the end sealed with a small plug of wax. As he stirred the bubbling molten metal, the wax would melt, invisibly releasing the gold into the mixture. When the crucible cooled, there it was, at the bottom, a shining bead of pure gold, a miracle. The court would gasp. The prince, his eyes wide with possibility, would see all his dreams coming true. He would immediately order a new wing of the castle to be converted into a laboratory and shower the alchemist with funds. The con was on. Another favourite was the doctored crucible. The puffer would prepare a crucible beforehand, painting the inside with a mixture of powdered gold and wax. When he performed his transmutation, he would heat the crucible until the wax melted away, leaving a thin film of gold fused to the bottom. To the untrained eye, it looked as if the base metal had genuinely transformed, or they might use a crucible with a false bottom, a tiny hidden compartment containing the gold, which would be released when the crucible was heated to a certain temperature. Some were even more theatrical. There was the trick of the half-gold, half-silver nail. A charlatan would present a large iron nail that was cleverly half-plated in gold, with the gold half painted over with a black, dull substance. He would announce he had a liquid, a small tincture of the philosopher's stone itself, that could transmute part of the nail. He would dip the blackened gold-plated end into a vial of liquid, which was really just a solvent or acid that washed away the black paint, and pull out the nail, now gleaming half gold. It was a stunning visual, a perfect piece of magical theatre. He wouldn't claim to have enough of the tincture to make tons of gold. Of course not. That would require much more work and much more funding, but he had proven the principle, and for a hopeful prince, that was often enough. These men were brilliant performers. They understood the importance of marketing and personal branding. They would often adopt mysterious, exotic names, claiming to be from some far-off land where these secrets were common knowledge. They would travel with a small, impressive entourage, live lavishly on the patron's dime, of course, and speak in a baffling jargon of cryptic pronouncements, hinting at immense power and divine favour. Perhaps the greatest of these performers, a man who burned so brightly and fell so far, was a man known as Marco Bragadino. He appeared in Italy in the late 16th century, a figure of immense charisma and mystery. He didn't just claim to be an alchemist. He called himself the Mammon, and hinted that he was the immortal son of a nymph or a spirit, gifted with the secret of eternal life and endless gold. He was a master of spectacle. He travelled in a magnificent coach, surrounded by servants in livery, and accompanied by two massive black dogs that he claimed were his familiar spirits, demons bound to his will. He arrived in Venice in 1589. At the time, the Republic of Venice was one of the richest states in the world, but it was facing enormous expenses from its wars with the Ottoman Empire. The city's leaders were desperate for a financial solution, and Bragadino arrived like an answer to their prayers. He didn't ask for much at first. He simply lived an impossibly opulent lifestyle, paying for everything in what appeared to be brand new, freshly minted gold. He hosted lavish parties, gave away gold as gifts, and generally behaved like a man for whom money was a triviality. The Venetian authorities, their interest piqued, invited him to demonstrate his art in a carefully staged performance. Bragadino took a quantity of mercury, added a pinch of a mysterious white powder, and, with much ritual and incantation, seemed to transform it into gold. The demonstration was a resounding success. The Venetian state, in its desperation, saw him as their salvation. They offered him protection, a palace, and anything he needed to produce gold on a massive scale. Bragadino, of course, accepted, but he explained that producing large quantities was a much more complex and spiritually taxing process. It would take time and prayer, and naturally, more money to fund the preparations. For over a year he lived like a king in Venice, bleeding the city's coffers dry while producing nothing but excuses. The work was delicate, the stars were not aligned, his familiar spirits were displeased. Eventually, even the famously patient Venetian merchants began to have their doubts. As the pressure mounted, Bragadino did what all good confidence men do when the heat gets too high. He vanished. He fled to Germany, to the court of Duke William V of Bavaria. The Duke was a deeply pious but also deeply indebted man, and he had heard the spectacular rumours about Bragadino. He welcomed the alchemist with open arms, ignoring the warnings that were now arriving from Venice. The whole cycle began again. Bragadino was given a castle, a massive salary, and the Duke's complete confidence. He promised to make enough gold to pay off all of Bavaria's debts, and to create an elixir that would make the Duke immortal. But Duke William was not as patient as the Venetians. He had borrowed heavily to fund Bragadino's work, and he wanted to see a return. The excuses began to wear thin. The Duke's questions became less friendly, more demanding. The theatricality that had once charmed the court now seemed hollow. The grand promises began to sound like desperate lies. Finally, the Duke's patience snapped. He had Bragadino arrested, and his laboratory searched. There was no philosopher's stone. There was no elixir. There was only evidence of fraud, hollowed-out wands, doctored crucibles, and a mountain of unpaid bills. The end for the charlatan was often as spectacular as his rise. Justice in the 16th century had a flair for the dramatic and the cruelly ironic. Bragadino was tried for fraud and witchcraft. He was paraded through the streets of Munich, dressed in a gaudy costume of tinsel and feathers, a mockery of his former splendour, and then he was taken to the town square to face his final punishment. Duke William had ordered the construction of a special gallows, a gallows covered entirely in gold leaf. The message was brutally clear. You promised us gold, so in gold you shall die. Marco Bragadino, the Mammon, the supposed immortal, was hanged on a gilded gallows, a final grim piece of theatre for the man who had lived by deception. This story, and countless others like it, highlights the terrible danger of this world. The line between being the court's most celebrated genius and its most hated prisoner was razor thin. An alchemist could be the prince's closest confidant one day, and be languishing in a dungeon the next, being tortured to reveal secrets he never actually possessed. Some patrons, upon discovering they had been duped, would simply have the alchemist quietly executed. Others preferred a more public and symbolic punishment. The gilded gallows was a favourite. Another was to have the failed alchemist melted down in a special suit of silver, a horrifying parody of the transmutation he had promised. Yet, despite these terrifying risks, there was never a shortage of alchemists, and never a shortage of patrons willing to fund them. The dream was just too powerful, and we shouldn't look back on these patrons as simple, gullible fools. They were often the most educated and powerful men of their age. Consider the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who held his court in Prague in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Rudolf's Prague was not the home of provincial superstition. It was perhaps the single greatest centre of scientific and esoteric inquiry in the world at that time. It was the Silicon Valley of the occult. Rudolf was a deeply intelligent, melancholic and curious man. He wasn't just some greedy king looking for a quick buck. He was obsessed with understanding the universe. His castle in Prague, the Hradčany, was less a seat of government and more a gigantic laboratory and museum. He gathered the greatest minds of his age. He was the patron of the astronomer Tycho Brahe, who conducted the most precise observations of the stars yet made. He was the patron of Johannes Kepler, who would use Brahe's data to discover the laws of planetary motion. And he was the patron of hundreds of alchemists. For Rudolf, alchemy was not a get-rich-quick scheme. It was the central science. He believed that if you could understand the process by which lead turned into gold, you could understand the process of growth and perfection in all things, in plants, in animals, and in the human soul itself. He filled a street near his castle, known as the Golden Lane, with alchemists, funding their research, poring over their texts, and eagerly awaiting their discoveries. The English mystics John Dee and his controversial scryer, Edward Kelly, spent years at Rudolph's court. Kelly, a far more dubious character than the scholarly Dee, famously convinced many that he possessed the philosopher's stone and could create gold. He became incredibly wealthy and was even knighted by the emperor, but even he could not escape the classic dynamic. When he failed to produce gold in the quantities Rudolf demanded, the emperor's favour turned to suspicion. Kelly was imprisoned in a castle, not once but twice, and died from injuries sustained while trying to escape. Even in the most intellectually sophisticated court in Europe, the patron's patience had its limits. The fall from grace was always just one failed experiment away. This intense, paranoid relationship shaped the very nature of alchemy. It's why so many alchemical texts are deliberately obscure and coded. Writing down your formula clearly was a terrible idea. If it worked, anyone could steal it. If it didn't work, it was proof of your failure. So alchemists wrote in allegory and metaphor. Gold wasn't gold, it was the sun, or the king. Mercury was the moon, the queen, or our slippery dragon. The process wasn't described in chemical steps, but as a mythical story. The king must die and be reborn. The grey wolf must devour the king. The peacock's tail must appear in the retort. This coded language served a dual purpose. It protected their secrets from rivals and the uninitiated, creating a sense of elite, exclusive knowledge. But it also provided a convenient excuse when things went wrong. If an experiment failed, it wasn't because the theory was wrong. It was because the alchemist had misinterpreted a metaphor. He had taken the dew from heaven to be literal dew, when it was actually a special kind of salt. He had heated the furnace too quickly and burned the flowers. It created a system that was almost impossible to definitively prove wrong, allowing the work and the funding to continue. And so this strange, high-stakes world spun on for centuries, a world of incredible intellectual fervour and profound deception, a world where genuine seekers of knowledge worked side by side with clever con artists, and it was often impossible to tell them apart. Princes and kings poured fortunes that could have built armies or fed nations into these smoky, secret laboratories, all chasing the same glittering promise. The hope of transmuting lead into gold was a dream that was simply too big to die. It tapped into the most fundamental human desires, for wealth without limit, for health without end, for power over the very substance of creation. It was a gamble of the highest order, played out in the castles and dungeons of Europe, where the prize was everything, and the price of failure was often a final, terrifying performance on a stage of gilded wood. And as the smoke from those countless furnaces clears, we can see the wreckage of broken dreams and empty treasuries, but we can also see in the embers the faint glow of a new world beginning, because for every charlatan there was a quiet, patient seeker who, in his search for the stone, was actually discovering the fundamental properties of acids, alloys, and distillation. They were mapping the unknown territory of chemistry, not for the sake of science, but as a byproduct of a much grander, more mystical quest. The patrons, in their greed and their hope, were accidentally funding the very foundations of modern chemistry. They were paying for a miracle, and in the end, got something far more valuable and enduring, a new way of understanding the world, a treasure they never looked for, forged in the fires of a beautiful, impossible dream. And now, as those fires burn low, perhaps you can let the clamour of those courts and the desperate whispers of alchemists fade away, leaving only the quiet, steady warmth and the deep, restful dark. Chapter 6. The End of an Era. From Isaac Newton to the sceptical chymist. And as those fires burn low, and the clamour of the courts fades away, you might imagine that the great work simply ended. that the last alchemist blew out the last candle in his laboratory, sighed a puff of smoky disappointment, and went off to find a more practical trade. But the story of alchemy, like the smoke from its own furnaces, doesn't just vanish. It thins, it changes shape, it drifts into new rooms and new minds, leaving behind a scent that lingers for centuries, because as the great public dream of turning lead into gold began to fade, the art was being practiced more secretly and more intensely than ever before. And its greatest, most devoted practitioner was a man whose name you know for entirely different reasons. A man who was, at that very moment, building the logical, clockwork universe of modern science. His name was Isaac Newton. Yes, that Isaac Newton, the man of the apple, of gravity, of the laws of motion, the titan of the scientific revolution, the architect of a universe governed by pristine mathematical law. We picture him as the epitome of cold, hard reason, but behind the public face of the Cambridge professor and the master of the Royal Mint, there was another Newton, a secret Newton. This Newton spent 30 years of his life hunched over a furnace he called his philosophical furnace, in a locked laboratory behind his garden, pursuing the philosopher's stone with an obsessive fervour that would have put any medieval magus to shame. For him, it wasn't a contradiction, it was the entire point. In our modern view, we see a neat dividing line. On one side there is the superstitious, mystical nonsense of alchemy. On the other, the enlightened, empirical truth of science. Newton would not have recognized that line. He stood with a foot planted firmly on both sides, because for him, they were not two different territories. They were two paths leading to the same summit, understanding the mind of God. He believed that God had written two books for humanity to read. The first was the book of Scripture, the Bible. The second was the book of nature, and he believed with every fibre of his being that alchemy was the key, the divine grammar, required to read that second book. Let's just drift back for a moment to his rooms at Trinity College, Cambridge, in the late 17th century. The world outside is buzzing with the new ideas of the Enlightenment. People are talking about reason, about evidence, about a universe you can measure and predict. But inside Newton's private world, the air is thick with the smells of the past. The acrid tang of nitric acid, the sweet metallic scent of mercury vapour, a scent we now know is profoundly toxic, and the constant dusty smell of ancient books and burning charcoal. He built a special laboratory, a small brick shed, so that he could conduct his experiments away from prying eyes. He worked for days on end, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep, his mind consumed by the great work. His cat, it was said, grew fat from eating the untouched meals left on his tray. He wasn't just dabbling, he wasn't a hobbyist, he was a master. He read everything he could get his hands on, from the classics like Hermes Trismegistus to the obscure coded works of his contemporaries like George Starkey. And he didn't just read, he annotated, he cross-referenced, he decoded. He amassed one of the largest private libraries on alchemy in the entire world, and he wrote, oh how he wrote. After his death, a locked chest was opened, and in it were found manuscripts totaling over 1 million words, all meticulously handwritten, all dedicated to the art of alchemy. 1 million words. That's more than he ever wrote on physics, optics, or mathematics combined. This wasn't a side project. For Newton, this was the project. What was he looking for? Not just gold. That was a vulgar, secondary concern. Newton was searching for something he called the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient wisdom. He believed that a perfect and pure knowledge of the universe had been granted by God to the earliest humans, to Adam, to Moses, to the ancient Egyptian priests, and that this knowledge had been lost or corrupted over time. He believed that the fables of Greek mythology, the measurements of Solomon's temple, and the cryptic verses of alchemical texts were all fragments, puzzle pieces of this original divine science. His alchemy was an act of restoration. He was trying to reverse engineer God's creation. His notebooks are a fascinating window into this secret world. They are filled with copied-out recipes, with strange symbols for antimony, mercury and gold, and with his own experimental observations. He writes of the green lion, the philosophical Mercury, and the star Regulus of Mars. He describes processes that take months, requiring the fire in his Athanar to be kept at a precise, steady heat, like a gentle summer's day for weeks on end. It's a testament to a patience and a focus that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. Imagine tending a fire day and night for a whole season, just on the promise of a cryptic text that a substance might be one step closer to its perfected form. And it was dangerous work, so dangerous. The constant exposure to mercury fumes likely contributed to the nervous breakdown he suffered in 1693. He became paranoid, suffered from insomnia and digestive issues, and wrote wild, accusatory letters to his friends, including the philosopher John Locke. It was a classic case of mercury poisoning. The very substance he hoped would unlock the secrets of transformation was in fact transforming him, poisoning his body and his mind. He was, quite literally, sacrificing his health on the altar of the great work. So here we have this incredible paradox. The man who gave us the laws of universal gravitation, who saw the cosmos as a grand, predictable machine, spent the dark hours of the night trying to coax a living metallic spirit out of raw ore. He was the last of the ancient magicians and the first of the modern scientists, all bound up in one brilliant, obsessive and deeply secretive man. He kept this part of his life almost entirely hidden. To the world he was a giant of reason. In the privacy of his lab he was a humble seeker of divine mysteries, speaking the coded language of Hermes. His life represents not a clean break with the past, but a slow, messy and fascinating overlap, a long twilight period where the old world of magic and the new world of science held hands in the shadows. But while Newton was conducting his great work in secret, another movement was happening out in the open. A very different kind of transformation was being proposed, not for metals but for the very practice of science itself. This public shift was championed by another brilliant man, a contemporary of Newton's named Robert Boyle. And if Newton was the last of the alchemists, Boyle was, in many ways, the first of the chemists. Robert Boyle was everything Newton was not. He was an aristocrat, the son of the Earl of Cork, one of the wealthiest men in Britain. He was gregarious, sociable, and deeply involved in the new scientific communities that were springing up, like the Royal Society of London. Where Newton was secretive, Boyle was a great communicator. He believed that knowledge should be shared, tested, and discussed openly, and he had a growing suspicion, a deep-seated skepticism, about the way the alchemists did things. He looked at their secretive texts, their flowery language, their reliance on ancient authority, and he thought, there has to be a better way. In 1661, he published a book that would change everything. It's a book with a wonderfully direct and confrontational title, The Sceptical Chymist. The very title was a declaration. It wasn't the Alchemist's Guide, or the Hermetic Secret. It was skeptical, it was questioning, and it politely but firmly took a hammer to the foundations of classical alchemy. The book is written as a dialogue, a conversation between several characters. There's a follower of Aristotle, a follower of Paracelsus, and a neutral observer, but the real star of the show is the character who represents Boyle's own views, Carneades, the skeptical chemist. Through Carneades, Boyle launches a systematic critique of the old ways. He's not angry or dismissive, he's just profoundly unimpressed. He applies a new and rigorous standard to the alchemists' claims, the standard of physical evidence. His first target was the very foundation of all alchemy and ancient philosophy, the theory of the four elements, earth, air, fire and water, or Paracelsus's three principles, salt, sulfur and mercury. For centuries, these had been accepted as the fundamental building blocks of all matter. Boyle simply asked a very polite, very reasonable, and very devastating question. Can you prove it? He pointed out that no one had ever actually managed to break down a piece of gold, for example, and find the four elements or three principles within it. You could burn wood and get ash, smoke air, and sap water, which seemed to fit the theory. But what about gold? You can melt it, you can hammer it, you can dissolve it in powerful acids, but you can't break it down into simpler components. So Boyle proposed a new definition of an element, a definition that is, with a few tweaks, the one we still use today. He said an element is a substance that cannot be broken down into simpler substances by chemical means. That's it. It's so simple, so practical. It's not about philosophy or ancient texts. It's about what you can actually do and observe in the laboratory. He was essentially telling the world of science, stop talking about what Aristotle said and start looking at what's actually in the flask. He was trading mysticism for materialism. His second major critique was of the alchemists' language. He found their deliberate obscurity, their poetic metaphors and allegories, to be a massive obstacle to real progress. How could you verify someone else's experiment if their recipe read like a riddle? If one alchemist's green lion was another's vitriol of Venus, how could anyone build on previous work? It was, in his view, a system designed to protect secrets, not to reveal truths. Boyle advocated for a new way of writing about experiments, a clear, plain, and detailed method. He argued that a scientific report should be so precise that anyone, anywhere in the world, could read it, replicate the experiment exactly, and get the exact same result. This idea of the repeatable experiment is the absolute cornerstone of modern science. It was a radical departure from the alchemical tradition, where success depended on the secret knowledge, the spiritual purity, and the unique intuition of the individual operator. Boyle was trying to democratize knowledge. He wanted to take it out of the hands of the secretive magus and put it into the public square. You can almost picture the two men as representing two different kinds of light. Newton, in his locked room, is tending the ancient flickering flame of a single candle, hoping its magical light will illuminate the face of God. Boyle is in a bright open hall, throwing open the shutters and letting the clear, neutral light of day pour in, believing that this universal light will reveal the workings of the world to everyone. The skeptical chemist didn't destroy alchemy overnight. Far from it. As we've seen, Newton continued his work for decades after its publication. But the book planted a seed of doubt. It provided a powerful new framework, a new way of thinking. Slowly, over the next century, the tide began to turn. The students and thinkers who came after Boyle began to adopt his methods. They focused on what could be weighed and measured. They published their findings in clear language in the new scientific journals. They began to build, piece by piece, a body of knowledge that was reliable, verifiable, and cumulative. This was the beginning of what we might call the Great Divorce, the slow, sometimes painful separation of two disciplines that had been intertwined for over 1,000 years. The new science, which was beginning to call itself chemistry, took custody of the laboratory. It got the glassware, the scales, the furnaces, the acids. It focused exclusively on the material world, on the composition of substances and their reactions. Its goal was not divine wisdom, but practical knowledge, how to make better medicines, stronger metals, more vibrant dyes. And what happened to alchemy? It didn't simply die. It lost custody of the physical world, but it retained custody of the soul. Stripped of its literal metallurgical ambitions, its powerful symbolism was free to be reinterpreted. The great work of turning lead into gold was no longer seen as a physical process, but as a spiritual and psychological metaphor. The transformation was not of metals, but of the human spirit. Lead became the symbol of the base, ignorant, unevolved human soul. Gold became the symbol of the enlightened, perfected, and spiritually awakened self. The laboratory was no longer a physical place of charcoal and beakers, but the inner landscape of the human heart and mind. This spiritualized alchemy found a welcoming home in the esoteric and mystical movements that blossomed in the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the most famous of these was Rosicrucianism. The Rosicrucians were a legendary, and possibly fictional, secret society, whose manifestos appeared in Germany in the early 1600s. They told the story of a mythical founder, Christian Rosenkreutz, who had travelled to the East and learned the secret arts of alchemy and magic. The Rosicrucians claimed to be his heirs, a brotherhood dedicated to healing the sick for free and working towards a universal reformation of mankind. Their work was explicitly described as a spiritual alchemy. They sought to perform a chemical wedding, the title of one of their key texts, a symbolic union of the human soul with the divine. The alembics, the crucibles, the processes of solution and coagulation, all were reread as stages of mystical development and spiritual purification. Another great inheritor of alchemical symbolism was Freemasonry, which grew into its modern form in the 1700s. While not directly descended from alchemy, it absorbed a huge amount of its symbolic language. The central metaphor of Freemasonry is building, specifically, the building of Solomon's temple. The individual mason is seen as a rough ashlar, a raw, uncut stone from the quarry. Through moral and spiritual work, through education and self-discipline, He is to transform himself into a perfect ashlar, a smooth, finished stone fit to be part of the great temple. This is the great work in another guise, the transmutation of the rough and imperfect into the smooth and perfect. The Masonic tracing boards and rituals are filled with symbols that have alchemical resonances, the sun and the moon representing the masculine and feminine principles, the compass and square representing the union of spirit and matter. So alchemy, the old art, didn't vanish. It simply went undercover. It put on the symbolic robes of the Rosicrucians. It slipped into the allegorical lodges of the Freemasons. It became a language for talking about the journey of the soul, about personal growth, about enlightenment. The quest for the philosopher's stone became the quest for the perfected self. The search for the elixir of life became the search for spiritual immortality. And its journey didn't end there. Even as the age of reason gave way to the Industrial Revolution, and chemistry became a dominant, world-changing science, the ghost of alchemy continued to haunt the Western imagination. In the early 20th century, it found a new and unexpected champion in the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Jung saw in the bizarre, dreamlike imagery of alchemical texts a map of the human subconscious. He believed that the alchemists, in their lonely labours, were not just projecting their hopes onto inert matter, but were actually projecting the deep processes of their own psyches. For Jung, the prima materia, the base matter, was the undifferentiated, unconscious mind. The long, difficult process of the great work, the heating, the dissolving, the purifying, the recombining, was a perfect metaphor for what he called the process of individuation. This is the psychological journey of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves, of reconciling our inner opposites, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, to become a whole, balanced individual. The conjuncture, the sacred marriage of the alchemical king and queen to produce the perfect androgyne, was for Jung a symbol of psychological wholeness. He spent the last 30 years of his life studying alchemical texts, seeing in them a forgotten tradition of psychology, a lost art of soul-making. And so we arrive at the present day. The physical laboratories of the alchemists are gone, replaced by the sterile, efficient labs of modern chemistry. No serious scientist is trying to turn lead into gold with a charcoal furnace and a cryptic poem. The scientific revolution that Boyle helped to launch was utterly triumphant. And yet, the alchemist has never truly left us. He survives in our stories, in our dreams. Every time you read a fantasy novel about a wizened old wizard in a tower, mixing glowing potions, you are seeing the ghost of the alchemist. The idea of a magical stone that grants eternal life and endless wealth, that is the philosopher's stone, still gleaming in our collective imagination. The very word alchemy has entered our language as a metaphor for any seemingly magical process of transformation, whether it's a chef who has an alchemy with flavors, or a coach who works an alchemy on a failing team. The enduring appeal is simple. The alchemists, for all their flawed science and their secretive ways, were chasing a dream that is deeply, profoundly human. The dream of transformation, the belief that the imperfect can be made perfect, that the base can be made noble, that the mortal can touch the eternal, that through dedicated work, through patience and knowledge, and a little bit of grace, we can take the raw material of our world and of ourselves and turn it into something golden. It was a beautiful, impossible dream. It was a glorious, spectacular failure. And yet that failure changed the world. It gave us the foundations of chemistry. It filled our museums with strange and beautiful artifacts. It enriched our symbolic language, and it left us with a story of hope, of obsession, of the tireless human quest to understand the universe and our place within it. And now, as the story ends, you can let that last image fade. The image of Newton, the secret magus, his face lit by the glow of the furnace. The image of Boyle, the polite skeptic, his face lit by the clear light of reason. The two worlds they represented have long since gone their separate ways. The fires have cooled. The arguments have fallen silent. The secret manuscripts are gathering dust in university archives. All that remains is the quiet. The work is done. The long night of the alchemists has finally given way to a different kind of dawn, and in the deep, peaceful silence that follows, you can let go of the quest, let go of the secrets, and just rest. Let the final embers of the great work cool into the darkness, and allow yourself to drift into a quiet and well-earned sleep.